The first thing I saw when I opened the salon door was my own face at 8 years old. The photograph stood on an easel beneath an arrangement of black roses, the same school picture my mother used to keep on the piano, except someone had enlarged it until my childhood smile looked almost obscene in that room. Behind it, a screen cycled through photographs of me as a little girl, a teenager, a college graduate, an employee at Bennett Family Funeral Homes. There was not one photograph of Nathan. At the front of the room, beneath a sign that read, "Farewell to our daughter," my mother stood in a black dress, with a tissue pressed beneath one eye, while somewhere between 30 and 40 members of my family sat facing her as though they had come to bury me. I was still wearing my wedding gown. My veil was gone, my hair had started slipping loose around my face, and less than 20 minutes earlier, I had been wondering why so many relatives had vanished before the reception dinner. Then I heard my mother say, "We're mourning the daughter we lost today," and whatever embarrassment I should have felt disappeared beneath something much colder. I walked straight down the center aisle, stepped onto the little platform beside her, took the microphone from its stand, and looked at my parents. "If you want to mourn," I said, "I've got a reason for you to mourn." Before I tell you how my parents managed to turn my wedding into a funeral for a woman who was standing 10 feet away from them, I hope you're doing well today. Stay with me, because what happened in that room was only the beginning, and the part my parents were actually afraid of had started weeks earlier. If you enjoy stories about families who discover too late that loyalty is not the same thing as ownership, subscribe to the channel and stay with me to the end. My mother stared at me as if I had violated some sacred ceremony, which was almost funny considering the ceremony was my own fake memorial. Dad stood near the first row in a black suit and black tie, one hand resting on the back of a chair, while my younger sister Mallory sat beside him with her mouth slightly open. I could hear the muffled music from my actual reception through the wall. For one ridiculous second, I thought about the dinner service starting without us, whether Nathan was wondering where I was, whether someone had told the planner what was happening, and I recognized the old reflex immediately. Something was going wrong, and my brain had already started organizing ways to fix it. I stopped myself. Then I looked around the room and said, "Yesterday was my last day at Bennett Family Funeral Homes. As of tonight, there will be no emergency calls, no unofficial transition, no stopping by because someone needs one quick favor, and no asking Nathan to convince me otherwise. Whatever happens at the company from this point forward belongs to the people who chose to run it." Mallory stood so quickly her chair scraped the carpet. "Claire, there are employees depending on us," she said. And then she did what she had done since we were children, whenever she wanted to turn an argument into a moral obligation. She invoked our family. She invoked our grandfather. She reminded me that the Bennett name had been attached to funeral homes in Cobb County for 3 generations. As though my marriage had somehow erased the last name I had carried for 38 years. Mom reached for the microphone, but Dad moved first. He caught my arm lightly near the elbow and said, "We need to talk outside." His voice was quiet, not angry, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. Richard Bennett did not become quieter when he was humiliated. He became louder. But when he led me into the hallway, I looked at his face and saw that the color had drained out of it. "You don't understand what you've just done," he said. The salon doors had closed behind us, but I could still hear Mom beginning some version of damage control inside. I pulled my arm away and told him, "I understand exactly what I stopped doing." Dad glanced toward the ballroom where my real reception was taking place, then toward the elevator lobby, as if he were checking who might be close enough to hear us. Mallory came out a moment later, followed by Nathan, who stopped several feet away and let me speak for myself. Dad lowered his voice even further. "This isn't about you being angry today. There are things in motion you know nothing about." At the time, I thought he meant staffing, vendor contracts, the ordinary emergencies that had followed me for years because everyone at Bennett Family Funeral Homes knew I was the person who would answer. I knew my father was afraid that night. What I did not yet understand was that he was far more afraid of records than he was of losing his daughter. I went back to my reception. That decision mattered more than it sounds. Half my life had been built around the belief that when something broke, the responsible person stayed until it was repaired, and in my family I had usually been the responsible person. But my parents had rented a separate salon, filled it with black flowers, collected photographs from my childhood, invited relatives into it, and staged a funeral for me because I had made a decision they could not control. I was not going to abandon Nathan, our friends, and the guests who had come to celebrate us so I could spend my wedding night negotiating with the people who had created the problem. I returned to the ballroom, took Nathan's hand, and sat down for dinner. 3 weeks earlier, though, I had still believed the hardest part of leaving Bennett family funeral homes would be convincing my father that I was serious. On September 27th, Harold Ellis walked into our Marietta location, carrying a brown accordion folder under one arm. Harold was 79, soft-spoken, always neatly dressed, and one of those clients I recognized before I remembered exactly why I knew him. His wife, Grace, had prepaid for funeral arrangements years earlier because both of them hated the idea of their children making financial decisions while grieving. Harold sat across from my desk and opened the folder carefully. "Diane said you'd reviewed everything," he told me. "I just wanted to make sure the changes were in there before Grace gets any worse." I asked what changes he meant. He handed me an old copy of the arrangement, and I pulled up the operational side of the record I was authorized to access. At first, nothing looked dramatic. Then I saw an internal note attached to the account. It said, "Claire reviewed. No concerns." I read it twice. I had never reviewed Harold and Grace Ellis's file, and I was certain because I remembered Grace, but I did not remember ever seeing that particular arrangement. I checked the date on the note, then looked again at Harold's folder. "Who told you I reviewed this?" I asked. Harold seemed embarrassed, as if he had caused trouble by asking an ordinary question. "Your mother. She said you were the one who made sure everything was handled properly." That sounded exactly like something Mom would say because, for years, it had been mostly true. I was the director of operations for our at-need services and 3 locations, and if there was a staffing failure, a family complaint, a vendor disaster, or a service that needed to be rebuilt at the last minute, I was usually involved. But pre-need financial administration was not mine. Dad and Mom handled owner-level decisions. Helen Price handled the books, and I did not sign annual pre-need reporting or control those accounts. I told Harold I would check the record and call him back. I did not accuse anyone. I did not use the word fraud. I simply wrote down the exact note, the record identifier, and the date. That was what my sister Mallory used to call my paranoia list. Its real name was less interesting. I called it the exception log, and I had kept versions of it for years because funeral service was an unforgiving business. A wrong spelling on a printed program could hurt a grieving family. A vendor arriving an hour late could derail a burial schedule. A verbal promise nobody documented could become a fight months later. So whenever something did not match what it was supposed to be, I recorded what happened, when it happened, who explained it, and whether it was resolved. Mallory thought it was excessive. Dad called it proof that I could not leave well enough alone. I considered it the reason I could sleep at night without wondering which problem I had forgotten. That afternoon gave everyone around me plenty of evidence for both interpretations. A refrigeration contractor failed to show at our second location. One employee called in sick before an evening visitation, and a floral delivery arrived with the wrong family name on 2 arrangements. I rerouted staff, got the contractor rescheduled, and worked with the florist until the correct pieces were on the way without making the grieving family aware that anything had gone wrong. Mallory came into my office while I was finishing the calls and dropped a vendor invoice on my desk from her Celebration of Life division. "Can you deal with this too?" she asked. 2 years earlier, I probably would have. Instead, I reviewed the discrepancy, told her which person she needed to contact, and pushed the invoice back across the desk. Mallory laughed and said, "Wow, Claire isn't handling it?" I told her, "Claire is leaving in 3 weeks. You should probably get used to that." I had already given Dad more than a month's notice by then. I was moving into an operations position with a hospice and bereavement network after the honeymoon, a job that paid well, gave me room to grow, and most importantly, ended when I went home. Nathan had never asked me to leave the family company. In fact, he had been careful not to. That night, when I told him about Harold's file over dinner, He did not tell me what he thought my parents had done, or suggest that he should confront them. He listened until I finished, then asked, "What do you actually need to know before your last day?" I told him I needed to know whether the note on Harold's account was one careless entry or part of something larger. Nathan nodded. "Then find that out. Not everything else. Just that." It was one of the reasons I trusted him. He never treated my competence like an invitation to hand me another life to manage. The next morning, I checked only records I had legitimate access to through my operational role. I found a second file with wording that bothered me, then a third. Neither said exactly what Harold's did, but both referred to my review or operational approval, in ways I could not remember giving. One status summary also failed to match the supporting information visible on my side of the system. None of it proved theft. None of it even proved deliberate misconduct. Software migrations created bad notes. Employees copied old language. People made mistakes. So I entered the discrepancies into my exception log and kept looking for the simplest explanation. The problem was that every simple explanation seemed to create another question. By October 3rd, I had enough questions that staying quiet would have been irresponsible. I went into Dad's office with my notes and closed the door behind me. I told him I was not accusing him, Mom, Helen, Mallory, or anyone else of anything, but several pre-need-related records were using my name or credibility in ways I could not verify. I said I wanted an independent review before my transition was considered complete. Dad leaned back in his chair and studied me without speaking. I expected irritation. I expected him to tell me I was overreacting, that Helen would clean it up, or that I had one foot out the door and should stop creating work for everyone else. Instead, his eyes dropped to the notes in my hand, then moved to the closed office door. His first question was not, "What did you find?" It was not, "Which accounts?" It was not even, "Are you sure?" Dad looked directly at me and asked, "Who else have you told?" The room seemed to shrink around that sentence. I remember noticing a framed photograph hanging slightly crooked on the wall behind him, and for once I did not reach over to straighten it. I told him, "No one outside the company." "Why?" Dad got up, walked past me, checked the hallway, and closed the door more firmly. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether I had found a clerical mistake. I still did not know what my father was hiding, but I finally understood one thing clearly. He already knew there was something worth hiding. Before I walked into my father's office and asked for an independent review, I spent 5 days trying to prove to myself that I was overreacting. That was not modesty. I knew I was good at my job. I had spent 14 years learning how to keep 3 funeral locations moving when grief, weather, vendors, employees, cemeteries, churches, and families all collided on the same afternoon. But I also knew one of my worst habits. Once something looked wrong to me, I had trouble leaving it alone. Mallory called that control. Nathan called it persistence when he was being kind. I called it the reason people trusted me. So after Harold Ellis showed me a file claiming I had reviewed something I had never seen, I did not immediately decide my parents were hiding a financial scandal. I went back to work and tried to find a boring explanation. The Bennett system had always been divided more clearly than outsiders probably imagined. Dad made owner-level decisions and controlled the broader financial direction of Bennett family funeral homes. Mom handled community relationships, longtime families, charitable events, and the social side of a business where trust mattered almost as much as competence. Helen Price had been our bookkeeper for years and dealt with financial records that never crossed my desk during normal operations. Mallory ran the Celebration of Life Center, the newer side of the company that handled receptions, tribute videos, catering coordination, live streams, and less traditional memorial events. I managed operations for our at-need services and locations. If a hearse needed replacing, I knew. If 2 employees called out before 3 services on the same day, I knew. If a cemetery changed a burial time, a florist sent the wrong arrangement, or a family threatened to walk out because someone had misspelled a name on a printed program, I knew. What I did not do was administer pre-need funding accounts, approve owner-level transfers, or certify the financial reporting behind them. That distinction mattered, because I had never been some exhausted daughter working for free while my parents spent my money. I earned a good salary. I had authority. Employees respected me, and for a long time I had assumed I would spend most of my career there. There was pride attached to being a Bennett, and I had enjoyed that pride more than I liked admitting later. When someone called the Marietta location in a panic and asked for me by name, part of me liked knowing I was the person they believed could fix it. The problem was that competence can become its own kind of vanity. If everyone keeps saying only you can handle something, eventually you can start believing them. Then one day you realize people have stopped learning how to handle anything without you. I had been 24 when I first understood what the Bennett name meant inside our family. My grandfather was still alive then, although he had already stepped away from daily operations. There was an old photograph in Dad's office from the opening of our original building. Granddad stood in front of the doors holding a brass ceremonial key, almost as long as his hand. Dad loved that photograph. He told the story so often that by the time I joined the company, I could have recited it with him. His father had taken over during a difficult period, refused to sell, and eventually expanded. Bennetts don't walk away when things get hard, Dad told me my first week. At 24, I heard strength in that sentence. I heard loyalty. I heard a promise that I belonged to something older than myself. It took me years to realize that the same sentence could become a threat if the person saying it got to decide what counted as walking away. Mallory had heard our family mythology differently. 5 years younger than me, she had never wanted the operational side of the business. She hated schedules, hated reconciling vendor disputes, and once told me that a room full of spreadsheets made her feel like the walls were closing in. But put her in front of a grieving family that wanted a celebration instead of a traditional service, and she was excellent. Mallory remembered names, understood what photographs belonged in a tribute without making it feel sentimental, and could take a nervous adult son who had no idea what his mother would have wanted and help him create something personal. The Celebration of Life Center had been her idea, and despite everything that happened later, it was a good idea. The problem was how quickly she wanted it to grow. Mallory signed ambitious vendor commitments, pushed for upgraded audiovisual equipment, and wanted a larger event space before the first one had produced stable results. I had warned Dad more than once that expansion should slow until the numbers proved the demand. He always gave the same answer: give it another year. When I asked how many years counted as another year, he stopped finding me funny. Mallory took my criticism personally because, in fairness, I sometimes made it personal. I thought she relied too heavily on charm and assumed somebody else would solve the expensive parts. She thought I needed everyone to see me as the competent sister. One afternoon, after I corrected a vendor schedule she had submitted without checking a conflict, she looked at me across my desk and said, "You know, Claire, sometimes people could actually learn to do things if you stopped grabbing the wheel every time they drifted an inch." I told her, sometimes people could learn to drive before they volunteer to take the bus. It was a good line. It was also exactly the kind of line that let me feel right without asking whether she had a point. I remembered it during those 5 days because I was trying to be careful not to turn Harold's file into another example of Claire Bennett finding a problem everyone else had missed. So, instead of confronting anyone, I went back through my exception log. 8 months earlier, I had recorded a status issue involving a pre-need arrangement that had briefly affected an operational decision. The explanation entered at the time was administrative timing issue. It had been resolved, or at least marked resolved, and I had moved on. Several pages later, I found another entry with nearly the same explanation. Different family, different date, same kind of language. I sat back from my computer and stared at the 2 entries until the crooked frame beside my office door started bothering me more than it should have. I got up, straightened the frame, then immediately felt ridiculous. That was what I did when my brain wanted everything aligned before I had enough information to make it align. I returned to my desk and wrote down the record identifiers rather than drawing a conclusion. Then I went to Helen. Helen had worked with my father long enough to remember Mallory wearing braces. She was in her early 60s, precise without being warm, and had a habit of tapping the end of her pen against her bottom lip while she thought. I had trusted her for years because she almost never pretended to know something she did not know. I asked her about the repeated administrative timing issue language and whether it referred to a normal delay in record updating. Helen stopped tapping her pen. Her eyes shifted from me to the office door, and the movement was small enough that I might have missed it if I had not already spent several days watching people's reactions. Richard handles the pre-need level questions, she said. I know who handles them. I'm asking what this note means. You should ask your father. I showed her one of the operational summaries I was authorized to see. There were initials on a supporting worksheet. Helen's initials. You worked on this. I work on a lot of things. Helen. Her expression tightened. Some things aren't mine to explain, Claire. That irritated me more than if she had simply refused. I had known Helen for years. We had worked late together after ice storms, service backlogs, and one miserable week when 2 employees quit within days of each other. She had never spoken to me like that. I left her office, thinking she was hiding something, and because her initials appeared on the worksheet, my first instinct was that she might be part of whatever I was beginning to see. That assumption would cost me later. At the time, though, it felt logical. The next file changed the problem. It was another internal CRM record, and buried among routine notes was the same phrase that had appeared on Harold's account. Claire reviewed. No concerns. I checked the timestamp and felt a strange little jolt in my chest, not because the language was dramatic, but because I knew exactly where I had been that day. I had spent the entire morning at an out-of-town training program and had not returned to the office until the following afternoon. My calendar confirmed it. There was no possibility that I had reviewed that file at the time recorded. I did not take a photograph of the customer file. I did not email myself a copy or download anything to my personal phone. I was still an employee, and I was not about to create my own problem while trying to understand somebody else's. I wrote the exact wording, timestamp, and record identifier into my exception log, along with the calendar entry showing where I had been. Then I sat there looking at my own name on the screen. Whoever had entered the note had not forged my signature. They had done something subtler. They had used my reputation as shorthand. Claire reviewed it. Claire had no concerns. If Claire had looked, everyone else could relax. That bothered me more than a simple bookkeeping error would have. Numbers can be corrected. A false story using your name can travel through a company without anyone realizing it is false because it sounds reasonable. I was the person who reviewed problems. I was the person who documented exceptions. I was the person clients and employees associated with things being handled properly. Whoever wrote those notes had understood exactly what my name implied. Mallory came into my office while I was still staring at the record. She was carrying fabric swatches and talking about a vendor disagreement at the Celebration Center. I barely heard the first half of what she said. When she realized I was distracted, she looked at my screen, then at the notebook beside me. Still building the paranoia file? It's called an exception log. That's what I said. I closed the screen. Do people in your division ever tell clients I've reviewed something when I haven't? Her smile disappeared. What? Simple question. No. Why would we? I don't know yet. Mallory studied my face for a moment. Is this about Dad? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. That response should have interested me more than it did. Instead, I asked why she had immediately mentioned him. Mallory rolled her eyes and said because every time I was unhappy with the company, I eventually ended up in Dad's office explaining how everyone else should run it. The comment hit exactly where she intended. I told her this was not about my opinion of her division or Dad's management. She told me I was leaving anyway and maybe I should try doing that without conducting an autopsy on the place first. Interesting choice of metaphor, I said. We own funeral homes. Exactly. She left angry. And I stayed angry for another 10 minutes before realizing I had done it again. I had asked her a question that sounded less like information gathering and more like an accusation. Nathan was right about me. I did not argue. I built cases. The skill had made me effective at work, but it also meant I could decide what a person had done before giving them much room to explain themselves. I wrote a note at the bottom of the exception log page. Do not assume identity from access. At the time, I meant Helen and Mallory. I would eventually realize I should have applied it to almost everyone involved. By the morning of October 3rd, I had enough to stop treating the pattern as random. Not enough to accuse anyone of fraud. Not enough to know whether money was missing, but enough to know my name had appeared on records I had never reviewed. Explanations were repeating across unrelated cases, and Helen was directing me back to Dad instead of giving an ordinary bookkeeping answer. That was why I went into his office and asked for an independent review. I did not repeat the whole conversation later because the part that mattered was his first question. He did not ask which files I had found. He asked who else I had told. I left his office with my suspicions sharper, but not yet complete. I still told myself there might be an explanation that was embarrassing rather than catastrophic. Maybe Dad had allowed sloppy internal shorthand. Maybe Helen had been covering timing problems she expected to correct. Maybe the company had become too casual about using my name because everyone assumed I reviewed everything anyway. Those explanations were weak, but they were still possible. What happened that evening made them harder to believe. Mom called while I was in my car outside a grocery store. I almost let it go to voicemail because I was supposed to meet Nathan at home, and I had spent enough of the day thinking about Bennett family funeral homes. Then I answered. Her voice was pleasant at first. She asked whether I had finalized the reception seating changes. She asked if my dress had come back from the final fitting. Then, without changing tone, she said, "Why are you digging through pre-need files 2 weeks before your wedding?" I sat very still behind the steering wheel. I had not told Mom what I was checking. I had not called her. I had not included her in my conversation with Dad. The only person I had spoken to directly about wanting a review was Richard. "I'm not digging through anything I'm not authorized to see," I said. "I'm checking records connected to issues that came through operations. You know what I mean." "No, actually. I want you to tell me what you mean." Mom exhaled slowly. "Your father says you're making a problem out of routine accounting issues because you're already halfway out the door." That sentence told me 2 things. Dad had called her immediately. And somewhere between my office and her phone, my request for an independent review had already become a story about my attitude. "I didn't accuse anyone," I said. "Then stop behaving like there's something to accuse." There it was. Not an answer. Not even curiosity. A warning disguised as reassurance. I asked, "Mom, why does it bother you that I want somebody independent to look?" She was silent just long enough for me to hear the turn signal clicking in a car somewhere beside mine. Then she said, "Because this family has spent 3 generations building trust, Claire. You don't tear into that because a few notes look strange to you." I looked through my windshield at my reflection in the dark glass of the store entrance. If the trust is real, a review won't hurt it. Her voice changed then. The warmth disappeared. "You have a wedding in 2 weeks. You have a new job. You have a husband who's going to expect you to move on. Maybe for once, let your father handle his own business." For years, that was exactly what I had wanted to hear from her. Let your father handle his own business. Do not carry everything. Go live your life. But she was not freeing me. She was trying to keep me away from something. I said, "That's what I'm doing. I'm leaving. I just won't let my name stay attached to records I never reviewed." Mom did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone had gone soft again. "Be careful what you turn into a family crisis, Claire. Some things can't be taken back once people start talking." After we hung up, I stayed in the parking lot with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Dad's reaction that morning had frightened me, because he seemed to know there was something worth hiding. Mom's reaction frightened me for a different reason. I had gone to my father with questions about records. By dinner, my mother was already talking about trust, family, people talking, and what could not be taken back. I had been looking at a business problem. Diane Bennett was already looking at a story she might have to control. The next morning, I stopped treating the problem like something I could solve by walking into the right office and asking the right question. I sent my father and mother a short written request stating exactly what I wanted: an independent review of the pre-need reconciliation discrepancies connected to the records I had identified, and no further use of my name, review, or approval on disputed matters until those questions were resolved. I did not use the word theft. I did not accuse Helen. I did not threaten to contact clients, regulators, lawyers, reporters, or anyone else. I also made it clear that my last working day remained Friday, October 17th, exactly as stated in the notice I had already given them. I read the email 4 times before sending it, because part of me still wanted to add everything I suspected. In the end, I deleted 3 paragraphs and sent only what I could prove. Dad came into my office less than 15 minutes later with a printed copy in his hand. He closed the door and laid the paper on my desk, as though it were something offensive I had mailed to a stranger. "Why did you put this in writing?" he asked. I almost laughed because that question told me more than any answer he could have given about the records. I said, "Because it's a work issue, and work issues belong in writing." Dad started pacing. He told me an outside review would cost money, waste time, frighten employees, and create questions where none existed. I reminded him I had not asked to announce anything to employees. I had asked for a professional to look at a narrow set of discrepancies. He said Helen could handle it internally. I told him Helen had already directed me back to him. Dad stopped pacing. "Helen shouldn't have discussed financial records with you." "She didn't." "Then why are you dragging her into this?" "I didn't." "You just did." His jaw tightened. That was the kind of moment that used to make me back away. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I knew what came next. Dad would turn a business disagreement into a referendum on whether I loved my family. Sure enough, he went to the framed photograph of Granddad standing outside the original funeral home with the ceremonial brass key in his hand. He pointed to it as though the dead could testify on demand. "Your grandfather built this when nobody would give him a chance." My father nearly lost everything keeping it alive through a recession. I've spent my entire adult life protecting what they handed me. And you're willing to bring strangers through our books because of some badly written notes. I'm asking someone independent to tell us whether they're badly written notes. You don't bring outsiders into family business unless you have no other choice. Then give me another choice that doesn't involve the same people checking their own work. Dad sat across from me and lowered his voice. "Extend your notice. 6 months. Let the wedding happen. Take your honeymoon, come back, and we'll work through this quietly." I looked at him. "You want me to leave the new job I already accepted? You haven't started it. I gave them my word. This is your family's company, and that is my career." He stared at me for several seconds before saying Nathan's name. He did not accuse Nathan of anything specific because there was nothing specific to accuse him of. Nathan had never demanded I quit. He had never even suggested it. But Dad said marriage changed people's priorities and implied I had become less committed to the Bennett name since meeting him. I let him finish, then said, "Nathan didn't write my resignation. Nathan didn't put my name on those files. Nathan didn't ask for an independent review. I did all 3 of those things myself." Dad rubbed both hands over his face. For the first time, he looked his age. "Claire, you think you're leaving a job? You're not. You're walking away from a family." "No," I said. "I'm leaving a job. If this family falls apart because I stop being an employee, then we have a bigger problem than my resignation." That conversation should have stayed between us. By lunchtime the next day, it had not. My Aunt Linda called while I was sitting in my car eating a sandwich between 2 appointments. She started with wedding questions, asked whether Nathan's relatives were arriving Friday, then went quiet before saying, "I don't want to interfere, but is everything all right between you and your parents?" I asked what she meant. She hesitated, which told me she had rehearsed how to say it. "Your mother said Nathan wants a clean break after the wedding. She said you're leaving the company and cutting your parents out because he thinks they're too involved in your life." I closed my eyes. Mom had taken 3 separate facts and stitched them into a story that did not exist. Nathan and I were getting married. I was leaving the company. My parents were too involved in parts of my life, but Nathan had not ordered any of it, and I had never said I was cutting my parents off. I asked Aunt Linda exactly what Mom had told her. Linda became uncomfortable and said she probably should not have mentioned it. I told her she had done nothing wrong, thanked her, and ended the call without trying to convince her of anything. For the next hour, I wanted to do something extremely unlike the version of myself I was trying to become. I wanted to open our family group chat and post my resignation notice, the dates, my emails, and enough screenshots to make everyone shut up. I wanted to explain that Nathan had nothing to do with my decision, and that I had been planning my career move before the wedding. More than that, I wanted to prove Mom was lying. I could already imagine the clean little timeline I would construct. Facts on one side, her story on the other. Case closed. Then I thought about the records at work. Somebody had used my reputation because it was convenient. Mom was doing the same thing in reverse. She was creating a version of me that would be convenient later. If I joined her campaign and started recruiting relatives to my side, I would spend the week before my wedding fighting for control of the same audience she was trying to control. So I did nothing. When another cousin sent a careful message asking whether Nathan and I were moving away, I answered only the question she asked. No, we were not. When she added that my mother seemed devastated, I said, I'm sorry she's hurting. She should talk to me about it. It was one of the hardest forms of restraint I had ever practiced because silence did not feel powerful to me. Action felt powerful. Documentation felt powerful. Correcting people felt powerful. But there is a difference between refusing to lie and believing you are responsible for correcting every lie someone tells about you. I was only beginning to understand that difference. I also knew enough by then to recognize that my own habits could hurt me if I kept digging through company systems after announcing a concern. So I made an appointment with an attorney I had used once before for a contract question, a woman named Karen Lowell who did not represent Bennett Family Funeral Homes and had no relationship with my parents. I gave her the narrow version of the situation. I told her my name had appeared in internal records I had not reviewed. I had documented identifiers and timestamps while performing my regular job. I had requested an independent review, and I was leaving the company in less than 2 weeks. I asked one question first. What can I keep without turning myself into the problem? Karen's answer was less exciting than television would have made it, and much more useful. She told me to preserve my own contemporaneous notes, emails sent directly to me, my employment records, and anything I was legitimately entitled to retain. She told me not to download customer databases, not to start opening records outside my normal responsibilities just because I was curious, not to email company documents to my personal account, and absolutely not to log into systems after my employment ended, unless there was a formal, authorized reason. If I remembered something important later, I could write down what I remembered and when I remembered it. If someone qualified eventually needed records, there were lawful ways to obtain them from the company. So I stopped investigating, I said. You stop trying to be the investigator, auditor, lawyer, and witness at the same time. That stung because it described exactly what I had been tempted to do. Karen noticed my expression. Claire, clean evidence matters. Clean hands matter too. If something is wrong, you don't strengthen your position by giving everyone a reason to argue about how you obtained information. I nodded. I hate not knowing. I didn't say don't ask questions. I said don't confuse access with authority. I wrote that sentence in my notebook. For years, I had treated information the way I treated operational problems. If a door was open and the answer was somewhere behind it, I walked through. That instinct made sense when a family was waiting for a service, and I needed to find out why a cemetery had moved a burial time. It was less useful when the question involved financial records outside my responsibility. Walking out of Karen's office, I understood that being smart did not mean doing everything yourself. Sometimes, the smart decision was recognizing exactly where your role ended. Helen made that lesson harder 3 days later. I found her alone in the break room after most of the afternoon staff had left for services. She was standing at the counter, stirring powdered creamer into coffee she never seemed to drink. When I entered, she looked at me, then at the hall behind me. I did not bring up the records. I had promised myself I would stop treating every conversation like an interrogation. I poured water into my bottle and asked whether she was ready for the transition after I left. Helen gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Is anybody? I've handed over the schedules. Mallory has the vendor escalation list. Dad has the location reports. That's not what I meant. I turned around. Helen set down her spoon. When you leave Friday, leave Friday. I waited. She continued. Don't agree to come back Monday because someone says there's one thing nobody else understands. Don't stop by after your honeymoon. Don't log in from home. Don't do anyone a favor. My first reaction was anger because it sounded like confirmation disguised as advice. What exactly are you warning me about? I'm warning you to let your last day be your last day. Helen, you're asking me to treat this like there's a line I shouldn't cross, but you won't tell me what's on the other side. Her fingers tightened around the paper coffee cup. I'm tired, Claire. Of what? She looked directly at me then, being asked to make things look temporary. The room went completely still in my mind. There were several ways to interpret that sentence, and none of them were comforting. I asked her what things. Helen shook her head. I've already said more than I should. If you've been changing records. Her expression hardened so suddenly that I stopped. There you go, she said. What? You didn't come in here asking whether I know something. You came in here waiting for me to confess to what you've already decided I did. I saw your initials. Yes, because I work here. And you told me to ask Dad. Yes. Why? Helen picked up her coffee and poured the whole thing into the sink. Because sometimes an employee tells an owner something is a bad idea, and the owner makes the decision anyway. That was the most direct thing she had said to me. I stepped closer. Did that happen here? She grabbed a paper towel and wiped a drop of coffee from the counter, even though the counter was already clean. Leave Friday, Claire. Then she walked out. I was furious with her for almost an hour. I was furious because she clearly knew more than she was saying, because she had worked beside me for years, and because she seemed to expect me to accept half a warning while my name was already floating through records I had never touched. But after the anger faded, embarrassment took its place. Helen had been right about one thing. I had walked into that break room believing I knew her role because I had seen her initials. I had treated evidence of involvement as evidence of guilt. Those were not the same thing. That night, Nathan found me at our kitchen table, staring at a blank page in my notebook. He set down 2 mugs of tea and asked whether I was making another chart. I told him I was trying not to. He sat across from me. Progress. I accused Helen without technically accusing her. That sounds efficient. I gave him a look. He smiled, then asked what had happened. I told him about her warning and her comment about making things look temporary. Nathan did not leap to the conclusion I wanted him to leap to. He asked whether Helen had actually said anyone stole money. No. Had she said records were false? No. Had she said Dad ordered her to break a law? No. She had said she was tired of being asked to make things look temporary. I hate how reasonable you are, I told him. You don't. You just hate it when I'm reasonable, before you've finished being angry. He was right, which made it worse. The following week should have been about flowers, seating arrangements, relatives arriving from out of town, and whether the weather would cooperate with the photographs we had planned outside the hotel. Instead, I kept getting small signs that Mom was building something around my departure. Aunt Linda stopped asking questions altogether. One cousin sent me a message saying, "Whatever happens, I hope you and your parents can find your way back to each other." Nothing had happened yet that required finding our way back. Mom was talking as if the separation were already complete. 3 days before the wedding, our planner called me about a venue detail I knew nothing about. "Claire, I just want to confirm the Bennett family salon is separate from your reception block," she said. I was standing in my bedroom with my shoes on the floor in front of me, trying to decide which pair I could survive wearing for 6 hours. What Bennett family salon? There was a pause. Your mother booked Salon B, directly with the hotel. For what? It says private family gathering after the ceremony. It's not under your wedding contract, so I hadn't included it in your final event order. I only noticed because the hotel asked us to confirm hallway signage. I sat down on the edge of the bed. When did she book it? The planner checked. About a week ago. Mom had not mentioned it once. I asked whether the room interfered with our reception. It did not. Salon B was down the corridor from our ballroom with its own doors, its own rental agreement, and its own setup. I asked what had been ordered. The planner said she did not have access to Diane's private event details because Mom had arranged those separately with the hotel. She only knew it was listed as a Bennett family gathering. Nathan came into the room while I was still on the call. I told him what Mom had done. His eyebrows went up. But he did not immediately decide it was sinister. Do you want the venue to shut it down? I considered it. I could have called Mom. I could have demanded to see the contract. I could have asked the hotel for every detail they were allowed to give me. I could have turned the final 3 days before my wedding into an investigation of my mother's private room booking. No, I said. Nathan looked surprised. It's a separate contract. It isn't interfering with ours. If she wants to have some dramatic family meeting after the ceremony, I'm not spending 3 days chasing it. What if she's planning something? She is always planning something. That's not comforting. I laughed despite myself. I know. What I did not say was that I was tired. Not weak. Not defeated. Just tired of giving every strange thing my parents did immediate priority. My wedding was in 3 days. I had already asked for a review. I had already put my concerns in writing. I had already gotten legal advice about protecting myself. If Mom wanted to rent a room and tell relatives that Nathan had stolen me from the family, she could waste her own money doing it. I was not going to cancel my life to supervise hers. Friday, October 17th, arrived with the strange unreality that comes when you know an ordinary routine is happening for the last time. I parked in the same spot I had used for years. I unlocked the same office. I checked the same morning schedule. There were 2 services, 1 visitation, a delivery issue, and an employee who wanted to swap a weekend shift. For most of the day, I did my job. I did not spend it searching records. I did not pull Helen aside again. I did not ask Dad whether he had agreed to the independent review because, by then, my written request spoke for itself. I handed over my remaining access items and documented the transition. I made sure the people taking my operational responsibilities knew what was theirs. When one manager asked whether he could still text me if something went wrong the following week, I almost said yes out of habit. Then I stopped. Text Mallory or Dad. What if they don't know? Then they'll figure it out. He laughed because he thought I was joking. I wasn't. The hardest goodbye was not Dad or Mom. It was the employees I had worked beside for years. Some hugged me. One cried. A young funeral director I had trained thanked me for teaching her never to promise a grieving family something before checking whether we could actually deliver it. That nearly broke me because it reminded me there had been real things worth loving about Bennett family funeral homes. Leaving did not require pretending every year there had been miserable. I had built things there. I had helped people there. I had been proud of my work there. Mallory appeared in my doorway near the end of the afternoon. She leaned against the frame and watched me put the last notebook into my bag. "You'll be back," she said. "No. Claire, come on. Something will happen Monday. Dad won't know where you keep some vendor number, or somebody will mess up a schedule, or a family will complain. You'll get one phone call and come running." The certainty in her voice irritated me because I recognized it. She was not insulting me. She was describing the pattern we had all created. I zipped my bag. "Not this time." Mallory's smile faded. "You're really doing this." "I've been really doing it since I gave notice." She looked down the hall toward Dad's office. "Mom says you're trying to prove a point. Mom says a lot of things. She thinks Nathan's pushing you away from us. Nathan isn't responsible for decisions you don't like." Mallory crossed her arms. "You know what I think? I assume you're about to tell me. I think you like being needed. And now you're angry because everybody got used to needing you." For a second, I almost fired back. I had several answers ready. I could have reminded her how often I cleaned up her mistakes. I could have listed the crises Dad had handed me. I could have asked how much of her division existed because other people kept absorbing the cost of her optimism. All of those things contained truth. Instead, I said, "Maybe I did like it." Mallory blinked. I continued, "That doesn't mean I have to keep doing it." I picked up my bag and walked past her. At the end of the hall, Dad's office door was closed. Through the narrow glass panel beside it, I could see 3 people inside. Dad sat behind his desk. Mom stood beside the window. Helen was across from them with a folder in her lap. None of them noticed me. For half a second, the old instinct rose again. Knock, go inside, ask what they are discussing, make them explain, do not leave until you understand. Then I remembered Karen telling me not to confuse access with authority. I remembered Helen telling me that Friday needed to be Friday. I remembered Mallory saying I always came back when something broke. I kept walking. The next morning, I was marrying Nathan. I had a dress hanging in my mother's old guest room. Relatives arriving from 3 states, a reception seating chart I had promised myself I would stop touching, and absolutely no intention of spending my final unmarried night chasing whatever conversation was happening behind my father's closed door. I knew Mom had rented a private salon beside our reception ballroom. I knew she had been telling relatives that Nathan was pulling me away from my family. I knew Dad was frightened by the idea of an independent review. What I did not know was what those 3 facts had to do with one another. At the time, I thought the worst thing my mother might do at my wedding was cry through the ceremony and make sure everyone noticed. I had no idea she had rented an entire room to bury me. On the morning of my wedding, my mother arrived dressed like she was attending a burial. Her dress was black, her shoes were black, and even the small silk wrap over her shoulders was black. Dad wore a black suit with a black tie instead of the charcoal one he had shown me weeks earlier. Aunt Linda was in black too, along with several cousins and 2 of Dad's longtime family friends. None of them had violated any rule the hotel could enforce. Black was formal. Black was allowed. But when I looked at them together outside the ceremony room, I knew it was not an accident. Mom hugged Aunt Linda with both arms and held on for several seconds. Her face pressed against Linda's shoulder as though someone had died overnight. When she came toward me, her eyes were already wet. I was standing near the bridal room entrance with my bouquet in one hand while our planner checked the final timing. Mom stopped several feet away and looked me from head to toe. For one hopeful second, I thought she might say I looked beautiful. Instead, she whispered, "I hope you're happy with what you're doing to this family." I looked at her black dress, then at Dad, then at Mallory. Mallory was not wearing black. She had chosen dark green, but she stood close enough to my parents that the distinction felt mostly cosmetic. I asked Mom, "Is this what the private salon is about?" She pressed her lips together and said, "Today isn't the time." I almost laughed. She had rented a separate room at my wedding hotel and arrived dressed for a funeral, yet somehow I was the person threatening to make the day inappropriate. Our planner approached carefully and asked whether I wanted a few minutes before the ceremony. Nathan was already waiting at the other end of the processional. 146 people had taken time from their lives to be there. We had paid for the wedding ourselves, planned it ourselves, and spent months making decisions that had nothing to do with Bennett family funeral homes. I could delay everything and demand that my parents explain themselves, or I could marry the man I had come there to marry. I handed the planner my bouquet for a second, adjusted the edge of my veil, and said, "We're starting on time." Mom stared at me. "Claire, not today." I took my bouquet back and walked toward the ceremony. That decision became important to me later because it was the first time that day I refused to let my mother's behavior determine my schedule. I did not feel calm. My stomach was tight enough that I barely registered the first notes of the music. But when the doors opened and I saw Nathan waiting for me, his face changed everything about where I put my attention. He was not staring past me at my parents. He was looking at me. So I walked toward him. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I remember that clearly, because for a long time afterward, People assumed my parents had ruined the entire wedding. They did not. They humiliated themselves during part of it, but they did not get to erase the rest. Nathan's hand was warm when he took mine. He stumbled slightly over one line of his vows and smiled before correcting himself. I laughed. Our friends laughed. When it was my turn, my voice shook during the first sentence, then steadied. By the time we exchanged rings, the row of black clothing behind me had stopped mattering. Mom cried through most of the ceremony. At first, guests who did not know what was happening probably thought she was emotional because her oldest daughter was getting married. But Mom did not cry quietly. She leaned against Dad. She dabbed her face with a handkerchief. She squeezed Aunt Linda's hand. Once, while Nathan was speaking, I heard the smallest broken sound from behind me, the kind of sound a person makes beside a hospital bed. Dad never told her to stop. When the ceremony ended, Nathan and I had photographs scheduled before the reception. My parents participated in exactly 3 family pictures. Mom barely looked at the camera. Dad's smile appeared and disappeared on command. Mallory stood between them with the rigid expression of someone who knew the situation was wrong, but had already decided whose side she was on. The moment the photographer released them, Mom gathered several relatives around her near the hallway. I was across the lobby with Nathan when I saw Aunt Linda touch her arm and ask something. Mom shook her head, lowered her eyes, and pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. Nathan followed my gaze. Do you want me to find out what she's doing? No. You sure? I've spent 14 years finding out what my family is doing. His mouth moved like he was trying not to smile. Fair. Then Mom raised her voice just enough. We're mourning the daughter we lost today. The people closest to her went silent. I turned fully toward her. Mom had not shouted. That would have been easier. She spoke like a grieving mother trying to remain composed for the sake of everyone else. Her eyes moved across the relatives gathered around her, not toward me. I know this is supposed to be a happy day, she continued. And I don't want to take that away from anyone. But some of us are experiencing a very real loss. Claire has made choices. We have to accept them, even if it means saying goodbye to the daughter we knew. Dad stood at her side. He could have ended it with one sentence. He did not. Mallory looked at me from across the lobby. Her face was tense, but when Mom turned and began walking toward the corridor leading to Salon B, Mallory followed. So did Aunt Linda. Then 2 cousins. Then Dad's friends. Then more relatives. Mom had turned it into a procession. The thing that shocked me was not that people followed her. Most of them had no idea what she had prepared. They had been told there was a Bennett family gathering in another room. Several looked confused as they moved. One aunt glanced back at me like she was asking permission without actually stopping to ask. I could have followed immediately. Instead, I stood beside Nathan and counted. 32. Then 35. By the time the last relative disappeared around the corner, there were somewhere between 30 and 40 people going into the room my mother had rented. My reception had not emptied. That mattered. Nathan's family remained. Our friends remained. Co-workers from outside my family remained. Most guests were already being directed toward cocktails and dinner. The ballroom staff kept working because they had no reason not to. My wedding was still happening. Our planner came toward me, pale with embarrassment. Claire, do you want hotel security involved? I shook my head. They're in a room Diane paid for. Unless they're disrupting ours, leave them alone. She lowered her voice. Do you want me to close your reception doors so this stays separate? Yes. But don't stop anyone who wants to come back. Nathan watched me. And what are you going to do? I looked toward the hallway. I want to see it. He did not tell me not to go. He only asked, do you want me with you? Yes. But let me talk. Always. We walked down the corridor together. The doors to Salon B were partly open. I smelled flowers before I saw them, but not the white roses and greenery we had chosen for our wedding. These were dark arrangements, almost entirely black and deep purple. Someone had lowered the lights. Soft instrumental music played through a small speaker near the wall. Then I saw the first photograph. Me at 8 years old. I stopped. The picture had been enlarged and mounted on an easel beneath a black floral arrangement. It was my elementary school photograph, the one where I had a missing front tooth and bangs Mom had cut too short the night before picture day. Beside it was another photograph of me in a high school graduation gown. Then college. Then my first year at Bennett Family Funeral Homes. The room was full of my life. Not my wedding. My life before Nathan. There were no engagement photographs. No pictures from our trips. No photographs of Nathan standing beside me. No evidence that the woman getting married that day had built a life outside the Bennett family. At the front of the room stood a large printed sign, "Farewell to our daughter." Nathan inhaled beside me. I touched his arm without looking at him. I wanted him to know I was all right. More importantly, I wanted him to know I saw what they were doing. This was not a spontaneous outburst from a hurt mother. Someone had ordered those photographs. Someone had selected the flowers. Someone had printed that sign. Someone had built a slideshow. On the screen behind Mom appeared a photograph I recognized immediately. Granddad standing outside the original Bennett building. Dad beside him. Uncle Walter on the other side. And in Granddad's hand, the ceremonial brass key Dad had talked about for as long as I could remember. Mom stood beneath it like she had planned the framing herself. "Some losses happen while the person is still alive," she said. Several people shifted in their chairs. I stayed by the door. Mom continued. "When Richard and I raised Claire, we believed she understood what family meant. She grew up in those funeral homes. Her grandfather taught her what our name stood for. Her father taught her the business. We thought one day she would help carry that legacy forward." Dad stepped beside her. I expected him to look uncomfortable. He did not. He looked solemn. The Bennett business survived because each generation understood that it wasn't about one person, he said. "My father taught us that you don't walk away when things get difficult. Claire has decided she wants something different." My anger changed shape. Until then, a part of me had still been processing the room as something absurd. Cruel, yes, but absurd enough that I could almost detach from it. Then I looked around at relatives listening to my father describe my resignation as abandonment, and I understood what the memorial actually was. It was a trial where my parents had already written the verdict. If I stayed outside, they would tell everyone why I had left. Nathan had changed me. I no longer cared about family. I had abandoned employees. I had rejected my grandfather's legacy. And if I later raised questions about company records, those questions would arrive after everyone had already been taught how to interpret them. Angry daughter, disloyal daughter, new husband, revenge. I did not know yet whether Mom had planned that far ahead. I only knew she was trying to define me before I could define my own decision. Mallory saw me first. Her eyes widened. Mom noticed where Mallory was looking and turned. The room followed her gaze. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mom said, "Claire, this was supposed to be private." I looked at the sign behind her. "You invited half my family. It's family business. You put my childhood pictures on easels." Mom's face tightened. "If you came in here to make a scene, don't." That almost impressed me. She had staged my symbolic funeral 50 yards from my wedding reception and still believed she could accuse me of causing a scene by responding to it. Dad stepped forward. "Go enjoy your reception," I asked. "Are you finished talking about me?" "Claire, that's a yes or no question." His silence answered it. I looked at the small microphone resting on its stand beside Mom. I had spent enough years in funeral homes to know something about microphones. You did not grab one when you were angry. You did not wrestle someone for it. You walked to it, adjusted it, and spoke clearly enough that nobody needed to guess what you meant. So I walked. Mom moved toward the stand at the same time. "Claire, no." I reached it first, but I did not yank anything from her hand because she was not holding it. I took the microphone from the stand and turned toward the room. My hands were steady. That surprised me. "If you want to mourn," I said, "I've got a reason for you to mourn." The room became so quiet I could hear the music from our reception through the wall. Mom stared at me. Dad's expression changed. Not anger, fear. That was the same reaction I had seen when I requested the review. I continued before anyone could interrupt. Yesterday was my last working day at Bennett Family Funeral Homes. I gave notice more than a month ago. I accepted another job before this wedding. Nathan did not ask me to quit. Nathan did not write my notice. Nathan did not make me cut off my parents, because I have not cut off my parents. Mom took one step toward me. Claire, that's enough. No. You rented the room. I turned back toward the relatives. I am not announcing anything about the company tonight. I am not accusing anyone of anything. But I am making one boundary clear, because apparently my resignation requires a memorial service. There will be no 6-month extension. There will be no Monday morning phone call asking me to come back because something broke. There will be no emergency consulting because someone says only I know how to fix it. Nobody gets to use my license, my work, my name, or my credibility as a family favor. Dad said, there are employees depending on that company. I looked at him. Then you should have spent this week preparing them for my departure instead of printing my obituary. A few people looked down. Mom reached toward the microphone stand, not the microphone itself. You're humiliating your father. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, if anybody in this room wants to know why I left my job, ask me. Ask me directly. You don't have to choose between my version and Mom's version. You can ask questions. I looked at the photograph of myself at 8 years old. Just don't let anyone write my obituary while I'm standing in the room. Aunt Linda's face changed. I could see discomfort where certainty had been. One cousin shifted toward the exit. Mallory looked furious. Are you happy now? She asked. No. You came in here just to embarrass them. They brought my elementary school picture. Mom is hurt. Suani. Mallory shook her head. You always do this. You make everything sound so reasonable that everyone else looks crazy. That accusation landed harder than she probably realized because there was a piece of truth buried inside it. I did build arguments. I did use precision when I was angry. Sometimes I could make people feel cross-examined when all I wanted was clarity. But this time, I did not need precision to make my parents' behavior look extreme. The black flowers were doing that for me. I put the microphone back on its stand. Mom said, we're not finished. I am. Dad followed me into the hallway. He waited until the salon doors closed before speaking. You have no idea what happens Monday if you don't come back. I turned. His face was tight, his voice low. Not theatrical. Not angry. Scared. Then Monday will finally belong to the people who made the decisions, I said. Stop talking like this is some management exercise. It was my job until yesterday. Today it's not. There are families depending on us. That stopped me. Not because I suddenly changed my mind, but because Dad had found the one argument he knew I would not dismiss. Families. People like Harold and Grace Ellis. People who had trusted our name with decisions they never wanted their children making while grieving. Dad saw the hesitation. There are employees with mortgages, he continued. Families with services scheduled. People with arrangements going back years. You don't just walk away from that because you're angry at your mother. I stepped closer to him. If those people are in danger because one operations director resigned after 5 weeks' notice, you have a management problem. You know it's not that simple. Then explain the part that isn't simple. He looked away. I asked the question that had been building since I entered Salon B. If you're this worried about Monday, why were you throwing me a funeral today instead of showing me the books? His eyes came back to mine. He said nothing. Behind the salon doors, I heard Mom begin speaking again. That silence changed something in me more effectively than any confession could have. I did not know the size of the problem. I did not know whether Helen was helping create it or trying to contain it. I did not know whether the strange notes in those files represented sloppy administration, a cash crisis, or something worse. But Dad had just told me families were depending on my return while refusing to show me why. That was not a request for help. It was a request for obedience. Mallory came into the hallway. Can you two please stop? People are listening. I looked at her. Good. She stared at me. I softened my voice, but not the message. Mallory, if Dad needs me back Monday because something is wrong, he can tell me what's wrong. He won't. Dad snapped. Because this isn't the place. Neither was my wedding. For once, he had nothing ready. Nathan had remained several steps away during the entire conversation. When I looked toward him, he did not ask what Dad had said. He could tell from my face that whatever had happened in the hallway had not made me want to stay. He held out his hand. I took it. We walked back to our reception. Our planner met us near the ballroom doors and asked whether we wanted to leave the hotel. Nathan looked at me instead of answering for us. I thought about it. Going upstairs, ordering room service, and locking the door would have been understandable. Nobody would have blamed me. But there were more than 100 people in that ballroom who had not done anything wrong. Some had flown in, some had driven hours. Nathan's parents were there. Our friends were waiting. And I wanted my first memory after leaving Salon B to belong to something other than my mother. We're staying, I said. The reception was awkward for about 10 minutes. Then human beings did what human beings often do when somebody refuses to keep feeding a spectacle. They moved on. The band played. Dinner was served. Nathan's best friend gave a toast that was supposed to last 3 minutes and somehow became 7. His mother cried for normal reasons. 2 of my cousins returned from Salon B looking embarrassed. Aunt Linda came back later and kissed my cheek without saying anything. Other relatives stayed with my parents. I did not count them again. That was another small victory. Mallory returned near dessert. Mom and Dad did not. She sat at a table near the back, spoke to almost nobody, and left before the final dance. I did not chase her. Near the end of the night, Nathan and I stood together, while the photographer gathered the few guests still willing to dance. My feet hurt. My hair was coming loose. The edge of my dress had picked up a gray mark from the floor. Nathan leaned toward me and said, "For a wedding with a funeral in the middle, this turned out pretty well." I laughed so suddenly I nearly spilled my drink. Too soon. Definitely. I rested my head against his shoulder. The anger was still there. So was the humiliation. But something else had appeared beside them. Relief. For years, every family crisis had arrived with an invisible assignment attached to it. Fix this. Explain this. Cover this shift. Calm Dad down. Help Mallory. Call the client. Make it work. That night, I had walked away from a room full of people discussing me and discovered the ceiling did not collapse because I refused to manage their feelings. By the time we finally went upstairs, it was after midnight. I had removed my shoes and was sitting on the edge of the bed when I remembered I had barely looked at my phone for hours. There were messages from relatives. A voicemail from Mom. 2 missed calls from Dad. I ignored all 3. Then I saw Helen's name. The voicemail had come in less than 20 minutes earlier. I hesitated before pressing play. Helen sounded tired. Not frightened exactly. Careful. "Claire, it's Helen. I'm sorry to call tonight. I know what day it is." There was a pause. Then her voice dropped. "Don't go back Monday. Whatever Richard tells you, don't go back Monday." I sat straighter. Nathan looked over from where he was taking off his jacket. Helen continued. "And don't delete that log of yours. The exception log. Keep it exactly the way it is." The message ended. I stared at the phone. All week, I had wondered whether Helen was part of the reason my father was afraid. That night, for the first time, I started wondering if she was afraid of him too. I listened to Helen's voicemail twice before I let myself sleep. The next morning, my phone looked exactly like the phone of a woman whose family had staged a funeral at her wedding and then decided she should still report for work on Monday. Aunt Linda had sent a long apology that stopped just short of admitting she had believed everything Mom told her. 2 cousins wanted to know if I was all right. Mallory had sent 4 messages, the last one asking whether I understood how much damage I had caused. Dad had called twice. Mom had left a voicemail I did not play. Then, mixed among all of them, was a text from one of our location managers, asking whether I could call a family whose service schedule had changed. He wrote, "They know you. It'll take 5 minutes." I stared at that message longer than I should have because the answer really could have taken 5 minutes. I knew the family. I knew which cemetery they were using. which employee was probably handling the arrangement, and exactly how I would calm the son, who tended to become angry when he was frightened. My thumb even moved toward his contact before I stopped. I had been gone from Bennett family funeral homes for less than 48 hours, and the system was already reaching outside itself to pull me back in. I replied with the main company number and the name of the manager now responsible for the location. I added that I was no longer authorized to speak for the company and wished the family well. Then I put my phone face down. It did not feel triumphant. It felt uncomfortable, which was probably why it mattered. Nathan came out of the bathroom and found me sitting on the edge of the hotel bed in one of his shirts, staring at the carpet. We were supposed to have a quiet breakfast before leaving for 2 nights in the mountains, the short trip we had planned because my new job started soon and neither of us wanted an elaborate honeymoon. He asked whether something had happened. I told him about the message and showed him what I had sent back. Nathan read it and handed me the phone. Seems right. I said it did not feel right. He asked whether the family had been abandoned. I told him no. The company had managers, licensed staff, and my father. Then you're uncomfortable because they didn't get their preferred person, he said. That's different from them not getting help. I knew that. I just had not learned to feel the difference yet. Dad called before we finished breakfast. I almost ignored him, but Helen's voicemail had changed the stakes. I answered because I wanted to know whether he would mention her. He did not. Instead, he began with a client problem at our Marietta location. A man was furious over a schedule change and apparently refused to speak to anyone except me because I had handled his mother's arrangements the previous year. Dad said, "Just talk to him. 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I don't work there. I know what day you left, Claire." "Then why are you calling me to represent the company?" "Because this man is upset, and you can fix it." There it was again. Not you are responsible. Not you are authorized. You can fix it. In the Bennett family, ability had always been treated like ownership of the problem. I asked whether the current manager had spoken to him. Dad said yes. Had the family been given the revised schedule and their options? Yes. Was there some health or safety emergency? No. Then the client was angry, not abandoned. Dad's voice hardened. He's 76 years old. His wife just died. Do you really want to hide behind an employment technicality? The sentence worked exactly as he intended. I pictured Harold Ellis and Grace. I pictured all the elderly couples who had come into our offices because they wanted to spare their children difficult decisions. Dad knew that was the part of the business I could never dismiss casually. So I answered carefully, "Give him the number for the manager responsible for his service. If he wants to file a complaint, give him that process too. If there's an issue with an obligation the company can't fulfill, have company counsel contact him. But I am not calling as a former employee and pretending I still have authority. You could solve this in 5 minutes. And then tomorrow it's another 5 minutes. This isn't about us. Then stop making me the solution." Dad went quiet. Then he said, "You're enjoying this." I stood up from the table. "No. That's the difference between us right now. You keep assuming that if I refuse to rescue you, I must want somebody to suffer. I didn't ask you to rescue me. You called me on the morning after my wedding to do my old job." He disconnected without saying goodbye. Nathan did not congratulate me. I appreciated that. Boundaries are much less impressive when somebody applauds every time you maintain one. We finished breakfast and drove north. For a few hours, my phone stayed in my bag. We walked, ate dinner, and talked about things unrelated to funeral homes. I discovered that a day could pass without me knowing how many services were scheduled in Marietta. The world continued. Then Mallory called that evening. I declined it. She called again. On the third call, I answered because repetition from Mallory usually meant either a genuine emergency or an emotional one, and I had not yet perfected my ability to distinguish them. "Did you know Helen quit?" she asked without saying hello. I sat upright. "No. She sent Dad an email this morning, effective immediately, says she won't be returning." Nathan looked across the room when he heard Helen's name. I asked, "Did she say why?" "Because she knows what's coming. Did she actually say that? She didn't have to. I closed my eyes. Mallory sounded certain, and certainty was contagious when it matched what I already suspected. Helen's initials had appeared on worksheets connected to the discrepancies. She had refused to explain them to me. She had warned me not to come back. Now she had resigned immediately after the wedding. Mallory continued. Dad's losing his mind. Helen handled half the reporting. And now she runs the second you start threatening reviews. I didn't threaten a review. I requested one. Claire, stop doing that. Doing what? Making every sentence sound like you're testifying. I almost snapped back, then remembered Helen telling me I had already decided what she had done. Do you know where she is? No. Why? I want to talk to her. Mallory laughed once. Of course you do. I did not tell her Helen had left me a voicemail. I was not ready to decide what that message meant, and after the wedding, I trusted Mallory even less with incomplete information. When we returned home 2 days later, Helen still had not contacted me again. I waited until Wednesday afternoon before sending one message. I did not ask for records. I did not accuse her of anything. I wrote that I had received her voicemail, that I wanted to understand what she had been trying to warn me about, and that if she was willing to talk, I would meet wherever she chose. She answered 3 hours later with the name of a coffee shop 20 minutes from Marietta. By the time I parked there the next morning, I had already constructed the conversation in my head. That was my first mistake. I imagined Helen finally admitting that Dad had ordered her to alter records. I imagined asking when it started. I imagined finding out whether Mom knew. I even imagined Helen explaining the notes that used my name. I arrived telling myself I wanted facts, but what I really wanted was confirmation of the story I had already built. Helen sat at a table near the back with a paper cup in front of her and no coat despite the cool October morning. She looked tired enough that the skin beneath her eyes seemed bruised. I sat down and thanked her for meeting me. Then, I ruined the first 30 seconds. How long were you helping my father? Helen's face changed. Not guilt. Disappointment. She leaned back. That's how you're starting? Your initials are on the worksheets. You told me people were making things look temporary. You resigned the day after my wedding. I know what I did. Then tell me. You didn't ask what I did. Her voice remained quiet. You asked how long I was helping Richard. I felt my shoulders stiffen. Were you? Helen picked up her coffee and set it down again without drinking. You came here for a confession, not an answer. That's not fair. No? You saw my initials and decided what they meant. I saw your initials on records that don't reconcile, because reconciling them was my job. And did you? Helen looked toward the window. Not always. That was the first admission. My pulse kicked. What does that mean? It means sometimes the numbers I was given did not match the numbers I expected. Sometimes money arrived later than it should have. Sometimes owner instructions changed how something was classified internally while they said they were fixing the underlying issue. Who is they? You know who owns the company. Did Dad tell you to falsify records? Helen's expression hardened again. Don't put words in my mouth. Then give me the words. I made adjustments I shouldn't have been comfortable making. What kind of adjustments? I'm not doing this in a coffee shop with you treating me like I'm on the witness stand. You called me on my wedding night to tell you not to go back. Why? She looked at me for several seconds. Because as long as you were there, Richard could keep telling himself everything would eventually be fixed. That answer was not enough for me. By whom? Helen gave me a sad little smile. There she is. Who? The Claire who thinks every problem has a person responsible for fixing it. I am trying to find out whether my name was used to cover something. And I'm trying to tell you that I am not going to hand you 15 months of bad decisions in one neat package because you're finally ready to look at them. I stared at her. 15 months? Helen realized what she had said and closed her eyes briefly. I leaned forward. Helen? She stood. I stood too. You don't get to leave after saying that. I left already. You worked there for years. So did you. That stopped me. Helen picked up her purse. I should have pushed harder. I should have refused certain things sooner. There are decisions with my initials on them that I wish weren't there. If you're looking for me to tell you I was helpless, I won't. I wasn't. Then help me understand. Not like this. She walked away. I followed her outside as far as the sidewalk. Helen, did my parents know? She stopped with her back to me. For a moment, I thought she would answer. Then she said, "Ask better questions next time." She got into her car and left. I stood in the parking lot, furious enough to feel heat behind my eyes. I had expected truth and gotten fragments. 15 months. Adjustments. Owner instructions. Things she wished she had refused. Every piece pointed somewhere, but none completed the picture. I drove home convinced Helen was protecting herself because she had participated. Nathan was working at the kitchen table when I came in. I dropped my keys harder than necessary and told him the entire conversation while pacing between the counter and the refrigerator. When I finished, he asked, "What evidence do you have that Helen designed any of it?" I stopped. "What? You think she was helping your father?" "What shows she created the system? Her initials are on the worksheets. That shows she touched them. She admitted making adjustments. That shows she made adjustments. She resigned. That shows she resigned." I glared at him. "Are you her lawyer now?" "No. Because you're doing an excellent impression." Nathan closed his laptop. "I think something is wrong. I think Helen knows about it. I think she may have done things she shouldn't have done. None of that proves the conclusion you walked into the coffee shop with." She practically admitted it. She admitted her part. "That's different." I opened my mouth, then stopped. Nathan continued, more carefully. "You know what bothered you most about your mother at the wedding? There are several candidates. She decided why you left before asking you. I said nothing. She decided Nathan changed Claire. Claire abandoned the family. Claire is angry. Then everything you did became proof of the story she already believed. You're comparing me to my mother. I'm saying you hate when she decides what happened before she hears you. The fact that he was right made me angrier than if he had been wrong." I turned toward the sink. Helen knew things were wrong. Probably. She helped. Maybe. That's not nothing. I didn't say it was. Claire, someone can be guilty of one thing and still not be guilty of the thing you're trying to make them confess to. I stood there for a long time. My anger slowly lost some of its certainty. I remembered the break room. Helen saying sometimes an employee warned an owner and the owner made the decision anyway. I remembered her face when I asked how long she had been helping Dad. Not fear. Offense. I had accused first and investigated second. That was not how I wanted to operate. The next morning, I called Karen Lowell. I told her about Helen's resignation and the meeting, including the part where Helen admitted making adjustments but gave me no records. Karen's first question was whether I had accessed any Bennett systems since my last day. No. Good. I still have my exception log. Your own notes? Yes. Record identifiers, dates, things I personally observed while employed. No downloaded client files. Keep it that way. I told her I wanted to build a timeline. She said I could document what I personally remembered, preserve communications sent directly to me, and keep my own employment-related materials. She repeated the warning she had given me before the wedding. No logging into company systems. No calling employees and asking them to pull records for me. No mass contact with clients. No fishing expedition. Because I believed something was wrong. "What if Helen has records?" I asked. "If Helen contacts you with materials she lawfully possesses, let me know. But a screenshot someone sends you is not magic. It can point to something. It doesn't automatically prove everything around it." That mattered later. At the time, it frustrated me. I wanted clean answers because clean answers were what I had always been good at creating for other people. Karen was telling me the opposite. If I wanted the truth to survive scrutiny, I had to tolerate uncertainty. So I spent that afternoon doing something that felt almost passive. I wrote. I opened my exception log, my personal calendar, and the emails that had been sent directly to me while I was still employed. I built a timeline using only information I could legitimately say I had seen or received. The first, old anomaly. The second, Harold Ellis. The false CRM note using my name. The day I had been at training when another note claimed I reviewed a file. My October 3rd meeting with Dad. Mom's phone call that same evening. Her private salon booking several days later. My final work day. The memorial. Helen's voicemail. Helen's resignation. I left blank spaces where I did not know the answer. That was harder than filling them with guesses. At one point, I wrote beside Helen's name. Involved. Then I crossed it out. I replaced it with touched records. Warned me. Resigned. Admitted adjustments. Evidence first. Conclusion second. It was a small correction, but I remember it because I had spent years believing intelligence meant reaching the answer faster than everyone else. I was beginning to understand that sometimes intelligence meant refusing to call something an answer before you had earned it. The family pressure did not stop while I was doing this. Mom sent messages through relatives instead of directly to me. One aunt asked whether I really intended to let elderly people lose everything just to punish Dad. A cousin told me the funeral homes might close if I kept pushing this review thing. Neither person knew what review meant. Neither could tell me what they believed I had reported. They had simply received Mom's version, where my questions had already become destruction. I corrected only the part that mattered. I haven't tried to close anything, I told Aunt Linda when she finally called. I asked for independent review of records that used my name incorrectly. Your mother says this could ruin the company. If checking the records ruins the company, the checking isn't the cause. Linda sighed. Your mother is beside herself. I believe you. She's still your mother. I know exactly who she is. I regretted the sharpness as soon as I said it, but I did not apologize for the boundary. Meanwhile, the small consequences of my departure continued. A former employee texted asking where a vendor agreement was stored. I told him to ask his current manager. Someone else asked whether I remembered the direct number for a cemetery coordinator. I sent the public office number, not the private contact I had used professionally. Mallory called because one of her vendors was threatening to suspend service over an unresolved invoice. Who handled these before? She asked. You did. No, I sent them to you when they escalated. Exactly. Can you just tell me what you would say? I almost did. Then I said, ask them what they need to resolve it. Decide whether it's reasonable. If it is, resolve it. If it isn't, negotiate. There was silence. That's your advice? That's the job. You are being unbelievably smug. No. I'm being unavailable. She hung up. 2 hours later, she sent me a message saying the vendor had agreed to revise terms. I stared at it and smiled despite myself. Mallory could solve problems. She just had not needed to often enough. Near the end of October, Helen finally contacted me again. No greeting, no apology, just a message that said, I shouldn't have walked out. I was angry. You were also asking the wrong question. Below it was an attachment. Before opening it, I forwarded the message to Karen and asked whether I should look. Karen told me I could read what had been voluntarily sent to me, but not to alter it, redistribute it casually, or treat it as authenticated proof of anything beyond what it appeared to show. I opened the attachment. It was a PDF image of an email chain. The oldest visible message was from Helen to Dad and Mom. The subject line referred to reconciliation. Most of the account details had been cut off from the preview Helen sent, which I assumed was intentional. What mattered was one line in Helen's message. I cannot reconcile these balances without documenting the shortfall. I read it once, then again. Shortfall. Until that moment, I had been careful even inside my own head. Discrepancies, timing issues, adjustments, strange notes. Shortfall was different. Beneath Helen's message was part of Dad's reply, but the preview cut off before I could see the full text. I could make out only the beginning of a sentence about using the prior method. Then I saw Mom's message. It was not dramatic. That was what made it worse. Diane had written, keep the reconciliation warning in the owner file. Claire only needs the operations version for transition. I read it 3 times. There were innocent-sounding ways to explain that sentence. I knew that immediately. Companies compartmentalized information. Owners saw things operations directors did not. I had already acknowledged that pre-need financial administration was outside my direct responsibility. Mom could argue she was protecting confidentiality. She could argue she wanted me focused on transition. She could even argue she was trying to keep me from worrying 2 weeks before my wedding. But that was no longer the question bothering me. The question was why there had been a reconciliation warning in the first place, and why, before I had ever asked for an independent review, my mother had already decided I should not see it. I called Helen the morning after she sent me the email chain, but this time I did not start with an accusation. I asked whether she was willing to sit down again and tell me what she personally knew, what she personally did, and what she was only assuming. She was quiet for so long I thought she might hang up. Then she said, "That's a better question." We met 2 days later in the conference room at Karen Lowell's office, not because I intended to turn Helen into a witness on command, but because I had finally learned that a coffee shop was not the place to untangle 18 months of financial decisions I only partly understood. Helen came alone. She carried a slim folder and looked like she had not slept well since leaving Bennett family funeral homes. Before we started, Karen made the boundaries clear. Helen could explain events she personally remembered and provide communications she had legitimately received or sent. We were not going to ask her to access Bennett systems, retrieve anything she no longer had a right to retrieve, or turn screenshots into conclusions they could not support. Helen nodded through all of it. Then she looked at me and said, "You want to know when I first realized temporary wasn't temporary?" I said yes. Helen traced it back about 18 months. Not to one dramatic transfer or one meeting where Dad announced that he planned to break every rule in the business. It started with balances that did not arrive where she expected them when she expected them. A group of pre-need payments had been received, but the amounts that should have moved into the proper funding process were delayed. At first, the explanation really had sounded temporary, a processor issue, a timing difference, a cash management problem that would be corrected after a strong month. Helen had seen normal timing differences before. Businesses were messy. Records were not always updated at the exact same moment money moved. Then another group failed to reconcile cleanly. Then another. Helen said she started tracking the differences separately, because Dad kept insisting the outstanding items would catch up after the next quarter. Some did. Others appeared to catch up only because later cash came in while new obligations remained pending. She did not pretend she had immediately understood the full pattern. I kept thinking if one strong quarter hit, Richard would put everything where it belonged and I'd have made myself sick over nothing, she said. I asked, "And when did you stop believing that?" Helen pressed her fingertips against the folder. When the explanation started repeating more consistently than the corrections. That sounded painfully familiar. My exception log had shown me the same thing from the operational side. Different accounts. Similar language. Administrative timing issue. Pending transfer. Temporary difference. 2 people had been looking at different ends of the same machine. Helen admitted she had made adjustments on internal schedules. Some involved carrying items forward instead of escalating them as unresolved. Some involved classifications she accepted because Dad told her the underlying movement would be corrected soon. She had not personally taken customer money. She had not designed the structure. But she had helped keep ugly information from looking as ugly as it was. "Why?" I asked. Helen gave me an exhausted look. "Because I'm 62 years old, Claire. Because I had health insurance there. Because I had a mortgage. Because I've worked for your family most of my adult life, and every time I thought I had reached the line, your father moved it 2 inches and told me the fix was coming next month." She did not ask me to forgive her. That mattered. "I should have refused sooner," she said. "I should have put more objections in writing earlier. I told myself I wasn't authorizing anything. I told myself Richard owned the company and the decisions were his. That was how I made it tolerable. Did you know customer obligations could be affected? I knew the balances were becoming harder to defend. I did not know the final scope. I still don't. That answer frustrated me because I wanted a number, but it was the right answer. Helen could tell me what she had seen. She could not magically calculate everything from outside the company after resigning. She opened the folder and pulled out printed copies of email messages she had been part of. Karen asked whether Helen still had the original messages in the account or device where she had lawfully retained them. Helen explained what she had and how she had kept them. Karen did not call them verified evidence. She called them potential source material and told both of us that if a formal review moved forward, the company originals and metadata would matter far more than our printouts. The first message was Helen's. It was the same line she had sent me in the PDF, but now I could see the surrounding paragraph. She had written to Dad and Mom that several balances could no longer be explained as ordinary processing delays. She specifically said she could not reconcile the amounts without documenting the shortfall and recommended that the outstanding items be elevated rather than continuing to carry them forward as temporary. Dad replied the same afternoon. Use the prior reporting method. We'll correct it after next quarter. I read the sentence twice. There were no threats. No admission that he had stolen anything. No detailed explanation of where the money had gone. In isolation, it could still be described as bad management judgment. A business owner facing a cash problem telling his controller to keep using a method while he tried to correct the underlying issue. But it removed one possibility I had been clinging to. Dad could no longer be the man who simply had no idea there was a problem. Helen had told him. He had answered, and his answer had been to continue. I looked at Helen. Did he ever explain how the next quarter was supposed to fix it? Better revenue, lower expenses, the celebration division getting traction. He had a different answer depending on the week. Did it ever catch up? Some pieces did. And the rest? Her mouth tightened. That's what somebody needs to reconcile properly. I turned back to Dad's email. For most of my life, Richard Bennett's greatest strength had been persistence. If a location had one bad year, he gave it another year. If a vendor relationship became difficult, he believed it could be repaired. If a new idea cost more than expected, he hated abandoning it before it had a chance to prove itself. Those traits had helped build the company. The problem was that persistence and denial can look almost identical when the person making the decision refuses to define a stopping point. The next email was from Mom. It followed a discussion about what material should be included in transition summaries while I prepared to leave. The sentence Helen had sent me was there in full. Keep the reconciliation warning in the owner file. Claire only needs the operations version for transition. Mom added another line farther down. She worries enough as it is. We need her focused on operations and the wedding. I stared at those words until they blurred. There was nothing openly sinister about them. That was almost worse. My mother had said versions of that sentence to me my entire adult life. Don't worry about Dad's blood pressure. You already have enough on your plate. Don't worry about Mallory's budget. Your sister will figure it out. Don't worry about the loan. That's owner business. Don't worry about Christmas dinner. I'll handle the family. Whenever I was carrying too much, Mom was the person most likely to put a hand on my shoulder and say, "Sweetheart, you don't have to manage everything." I had interpreted that as one of her better qualities. Now I had an email showing her using exactly the same language to decide which version of a financial problem I was allowed to see. I said, "She made it sound like she was protecting me." Helen did not answer immediately. Then she said, "Diane is very good at making control sound like care." That sentence hurt more than Dad's email. I remembered Mom on the phone before the wedding telling me to stop turning routine issues into a family crisis. I remembered her telling relatives Nathan had changed me. I remembered the black flowers, the childhood photographs, and the sign saying farewell to our daughter. Until then, I had been thinking of the memorial as a separate cruelty, an emotional explosion. A mother furious that her oldest daughter had left the family company and married a man she could not control. But the dates no longer sat separately in my mind. I went home that afternoon and opened the timeline I had built from my own records. September 27th. Harold Ellis told me Mom said I had reviewed his arrangement. October 3rd. I put my request for an independent review in writing. October 7th. Mom booked the separate salon at the wedding hotel. October 18th. She gathered relatives in that room and presented me as the daughter who had abandoned her family. I wrote the 4 dates on one page. Nathan came home while I was still staring at them. He set his keys on the counter and asked, "What changed?" I turned the notebook toward him. He read the dates. I said, "I think the memorial was part of the same thing." Nathan did not immediately agree. Part of what? Making me unreliable before I said anything. "Can you prove that?" The question was so irritatingly perfect that I almost smiled. "No. What can you prove?" "I can prove I asked for a review on October 3rd. I can prove she booked the room afterward. I can prove she told family I was leaving because of you. I can prove the emails Helen has shown Mom limiting what I could see before I left. And the reason she booked the room? I can't prove that yet." Nathan nodded. "Then don't call it proof." I hated how often my marriage consisted of him saying the precise thing I needed to hear, while I wished he would say something easier. I closed the notebook. "I can see the shape of it." "That's different." Yes. At that point, I could see the shape. I still could not prove why my mother had rented that room. That distinction became the reason I did not make the mistake my parents seemed to expect from me. I did not post the emails online. I did not send them to every relative who had followed Mom into Salon B. I did not write a long social media post accusing my parents of stealing from old people. I did not even know enough to say that, and using frightened customers as ammunition in a family fight would have made me exactly as reckless as they claimed I was. Instead, I went back to Karen. We spent nearly 2 hours separating what I knew from what I suspected. My own exception log showed operational discrepancies and record identifiers. My calendar supported the fact that at least one note claimed I reviewed a file when I was out of town. Helen's copies suggested management had been warned about reconciliation problems and had continued the prior method. Mom's emails suggested she deliberately kept warning language out of my transition materials. None of those things, by themselves, told us the total amount involved. None of them proved every affected account. None of them gave me authority to march into Bennett family funeral homes and demand the books. So Karen helped me prepare something much less dramatic and much more dangerous to my parents than a public accusation. A documented concern. It stated my former role, the limits of my authority, the record discrepancies I had personally observed while employed, the fact that my name had been used on reviews I did not perform, and the existence of communications indicating unresolved reconciliation concerns had been raised with ownership. Through Karen, the concern went to the appropriate professional and state channel responsible for the kind of activity we were dealing with. I formally offered to cooperate as a former employee if information I personally knew became relevant. Karen also sent a preservation request through the proper channel to the company's counsel. She was careful about the wording. "This does not mean we control what they do," she told me. "We are asking that relevant records be preserved. If a regulator or other authorized reviewer requests records, that comes through their process. So, nothing happens tomorrow." "Probably not. No raid." Karen gave me a look. "Please stop watching television." I laughed despite myself. The laugh disappeared quickly. What if I'm wrong? Then, a proper review should help establish that. What if I'm right and customers get hurt because I started this? Karen leaned back. "Did you create the condition you're reporting?" "No." "Would hiding it improve their position?" "No." "Then your responsibility is to be accurate, not omnipotent." That word stayed with me. Omnipotent. For years I had behaved as if competence could eventually grow large enough to prevent everyone around me from experiencing consequences. Maybe that was why my family had learned to treat me like a service instead of a person. Nathan asked me almost the same question that night, but in simpler language. "Are you scared?" We were sitting at our kitchen table. The house was quiet, and for once there were no vendor schedules or funeral service calendars spread between us. Just my notebook and 2 cups of coffee. "Yes." "Of your parents?" "Not exactly." "Of being wrong?" "Partly." He waited. I said, "I'm scared innocent people get hit either way. If I say nothing and there's a real problem, clients could get hurt. Employees could get hurt. If I blow everything up publicly before I know the facts, Those same people could get hurt because everyone panics. So what are you doing? Neither. Nathan nodded. That was the decision. I would not hide. I would not explode. I would document and let people with the right authority examine what I could not. Mom apparently considered restraint less useful. Within a week, Aunt Linda called again. Her first sentence was, "Please tell me you're not trying to shut down the funeral homes." I closed my eyes. "Who told you that?" "You know who." "Mom?" Linda hesitated. "She's very upset." "What exactly did she say?" "That you've taken your anger over the wedding and gone outside the family. That you filed complaints that could put the company under. She says Nathan has been encouraging you to separate yourself from everybody." There it was. The same story from the memorial, now updated for the review. Angry daughter. New husband. Family rejection. Retaliation. I asked Linda, "Did Mom tell you why I requested a review before the wedding?" "No." "Did she tell you records were using my name for work I didn't perform?" Silence. "Did she tell you I raised those concerns before she rented Salon B?" Another silence. "Claire, I don't know anything about the business." "Exactly. I'm not trying to take sides." "Then don't." My voice came out sharper than I intended, so I softened it. "You don't have to believe me over Mom. You don't have to believe Mom over me. Just don't repeat things you don't know." Linda sighed. "Your mother says you want the place destroyed. I asked for records to be reviewed." That's not what she said. After we hung up, I sat there holding the phone and understood something I had resisted because it was easier to imagine my father as the central problem. Dad had created dangerous financial decisions. Mom had created the environment in which questioning those decisions became betrayal. Richard wanted more time. Diane wanted everyone to agree on what the problem was called. Temporary, private, family business. Claire worries too much. Nathan changed her. She abandoned us. She is retaliating. Every phrase moved attention away from the underlying question and toward the person asking it. My mother had not simply been covering for my father. She had been building the cover around him. I still did not know whether she understood every financial detail. I did not know whether she could have explained the reconciliation problem if someone put the ledgers in front of her. But I no longer needed to believe she understood every number to understand her role. Diane understood reputation. She understood relatives. She understood which version of a story people heard first. And she had been using those skills long before the wedding. The formal process moved more slowly than family gossip. For several days, nothing visible happened. I started my new job with the Hospice and Bereavement Network, and I made myself learn a system where my last name meant absolutely nothing. I was no longer the person everyone called first. I was the new woman asking where supplies were kept and learning who approved schedule changes. Strangely, I liked it. Then, in the middle of November, Mallory called. I was leaving work and had just reached my car when her name appeared on the screen. I answered because the last several weeks had taught me that silence did not mean safety. She did not say hello. "What did you do?" "I went to work." "Don't be cute." Her breathing was fast. I could hear voices somewhere behind her. "What happened?" "They got a formal request." My hand stopped on the car door. "Who got it?" "Dad. The company. Council is here. They're asking for records." I did not ask which records, because I did not want Mallory telling me anything she should be giving to the people authorized to review it. Instead, I said, "Then cooperate." "You don't understand. They're asking for everything." "Then give them everything." She went silent. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. "You really are going to destroy us." I looked through the windshield at the ordinary parking lot in front of my new office. People were leaving work. Someone was loading a box into the back of an SUV. A woman in scrubs was laughing into her phone. Nothing in the world looked dramatic enough for what Mallory had just said. "No," I told her. "I'm going to find out what us has been hiding." The record request did not shut Bennett family funeral homes down. That was the first thing my mother got wrong when she started telling relatives I had pushed the company off a cliff. There were still funerals the next week. Hearses still left the Marietta location. Phones still rang. Families still came through the doors carrying clothes for people they loved and questions they were not ready to ask. But the business changed in quieter ways. Certain pre-need activity was paused while records were being reconciled. Vendors who had once given Dad generous terms started wanting faster payment. Employees heard enough fragments to know something was wrong, and people who had spent years assuming the Bennett name meant stability began asking each other whether their jobs were safe. I learned most of that the way any former employee might have. A few people I had worked with for years texted me. I answered personal questions and refused operational ones. When someone asked whether the company was closing, I said I did not know. When another employee sent me a picture of a revised work schedule and asked whether it looked sustainable, I told her she needed to discuss it with her current manager. I hated those answers. I knew enough about the business to have opinions about nearly everything they showed me, but having an opinion was not the same as having responsibility, and I was trying very hard to stop volunteering for responsibilities that no longer belonged to me. Dad told everyone the pressure was temporary. That word traveled quickly. Temporary review, temporary sales restrictions, temporary cash tightening, temporary confusion. I heard it from 3 different people in 1 week and thought of Helen telling me she was tired of being asked to make things look temporary. The same word that had once sounded reassuring now sounded like a place my father had been hiding for 18 months. By late November, Dad changed tactics. He stopped calling me to fix individual problems and asked for a formal meeting instead. Karen came with me. Dad's company counsel was there, along with an outside financial advisor I had never met. Mom sat beside Dad but said very little at first. Mallory was not invited. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room, not at one of the funeral homes, which I suspected was meant to make everything feel professional enough that nobody would mention black flowers or childhood photographs. Dad opened by saying, "I want you to understand the situation before you make any more decisions." I looked at Karen. She said, "Claire has already made her employment decision." Dad's jaw tightened. "I'm talking about helping with the transition." "What transition?" I asked. "The one we're going to need if this review keeps expanding." There it was, not if there was a problem. If the review kept expanding. The advisor placed a short summary in front of us. Karen read it first. It was not a full forensic report, and nobody pretended it was. It was a limited remediation document prepared from information company advisors had gathered so far, with several sections marked preliminary or subject to further reconciliation. It did not give me unrestricted access to company records. It gave me enough to understand why Dad wanted me in the room. One chart showed operating pressure over the previous 18 months. Another showed where working cash had been consumed faster than expected. The largest change I recognized immediately was the celebration of life division. Mallory's division. I leaned forward. The expansion had cost more than the operational summaries I used to see had suggested. New equipment, event space improvements, vendor deposits, staffing, marketing. A second phase Dad had approved even after the first year failed to meet projections. None of that, by itself, meant Mallory had done anything dishonest. Businesses invested in divisions that underperformed all the time. What mattered was where some of the liquidity had come from. The advisor's language was careful. Customer payments connected to certain pre-need obligations had not always been moved into the proper segregated funding process on schedule. The amounts that remained temporarily in operating cash had helped the company meet other expenses, including expenses connected to Mallory's expansion. Later, receipts had been used to catch up some earlier obligations, while other new obligations remained outstanding. No one said Mallory had transferred the money. No one showed her signature authorizing anything. But her division had benefited. I felt anger before I felt caution. "How long did Mallory know?" I asked. Dad immediately said, "She didn't." I turned to him. "You expect me to believe she ran a division that kept expanding while the numbers were failing and never wondered where the money was coming from?" "She ran events. I handled financing." Mom finally spoke. "This is exactly why we did not want you involved in the financial side. You take one piece of information and decide who deserves blame. I looked at her. You didn't keep me out because I blame people too fast, didn't we? That landed because there was enough truth in it to irritate me. Karen touched the edge of the summary. This document does not establish that Mallory authorized any improper funding decision. I can read. Dad leaned toward me, then read the whole thing. We can stabilize this. The review doesn't have to become a public disaster. But I need people who understand the operation, and you understand it better than anyone. There was the offer. Not an apology. Not an explanation for the memorial. Ayob. Doing what? Come back for 6 months. Help separate the affected obligations, stabilize staff, reassure families, and help us restructure the locations. You have managers. They're not you, Mom said. Your father is trying to save what your grandfather built. I looked around the conference table. Months earlier, that sentence might have worked. I might have heard history, duty, employees, clients, and my own pride all at once. Now I heard a much simpler request. Come stand under it again. I slid the summary back toward Dad. I'm willing to provide information I legitimately know if the people conducting the review ask me. I am not coming back as an employee. You've seen what's at stake. Yes. And you're still saying no? Especially now. Dad stared at me as though I had failed some test. I left with one question I could not let go. Mallory. I called her that evening and asked to meet. She arrived at a small restaurant near her apartment, already angry. She did not take off her coat before saying, "If this is another interrogation, I'm leaving." I saw a limited summary today. Her face changed slightly. Dad showed you? He was trying to convince me to come back. Of course he was. It shows the celebration division absorbed far more cash than I knew. Mallory sat down slowly. I stayed standing for a moment before taking the chair across from her. How much did you know? About what? Don't do that. Her eyes hardened. I never touched a pre-need account. I didn't ask whether you touched one. I never authorized transfers. I never even had access to those accounts. You knew the division wasn't supporting its own expansion. I knew we were still in investment mode. For 2 years? Businesses don't become profitable on Claire Bennett's preferred schedule just because Claire Bennett makes a spreadsheet. There was the old fight waiting for us, perfectly preserved. I leaned closer. You had vendors getting paid while your numbers missed projections quarter after quarter? You ordered upgrades after I told Dad to slow expansion? You never asked where the money came from? I asked Dad. I stopped. Mallory pulled out her phone. You're so sure you know me, she said. Read. She opened an old email thread and turned the screen toward me. The message was from Mallory to Dad, sent months before my wedding. She had written that her division's revenue did not seem high enough to support another round of planned spending and asked whether the expansion should be delayed until cash flow improved. Dad's reply was short. Claire has operations handled. I have financing handled. Keep building the division. I read it twice. The anger I had brought into the restaurant suddenly had nowhere clean to land. Mallory folded her arms. I didn't know. I handed back the phone. You asked once. Yes. And then? What was I supposed to do? Audit Dad? You were supposed to ask again. I ran the division. I didn't run company finance. Neither did I, and somehow I still asked questions when things stopped making sense. Mallory laughed bitterly. There it is. What? Saint Clair. I didn't say I was a saint. You don't have to. You always stand there with the facts arranged perfectly and make everyone else explain why they aren't you. My first instinct was to defend myself. Instead, I said, fine. I came here convinced you knew more than I could prove. Mallory looked surprised. I was wrong about that part. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Then I asked, but after Dad sent that email, did you believe his answer? Mallory did not respond. That silence lasted long enough to answer me. Mallory. She looked toward the window. No. I felt something heavier than anger settle into place. You knew it didn't make sense. I knew Dad wasn't answering the question I asked. And you didn't ask again. Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed hard. Because I knew what would happen if I kept asking. What? He'd freeze the expansion, maybe shut the division down. So you chose not to know. I chose to trust Dad. No. She looked back at me. You didn't know, I said. I didn't. No. You made sure you didn't. The words sat between us. Mallory's face changed, as if I had slapped her. And for half a second I regretted saying it that sharply. Then she looked down at her phone. I thought if there was a real problem, you would know. I almost missed the cruelty of that sentence because she said it so quietly. Why? Because you knew everything. I didn't. You always knew when a location was losing money. You knew when vendors were late. You knew when Dad was stretching something too far. You were there. Not in those accounts. I know that now. No, Mallory. You knew that then. You knew I didn't handle pre-need finance. She rubbed her forehead. Maybe I didn't think about the distinction, because it was easier not to. She did not deny it. That was Mallory's betrayal. Not a secret signature, not a hidden bank transfer, not some late-night conspiracy with Dad. She had seen enough to become uncomfortable and chosen comfort instead. I left the restaurant less certain and more disappointed. Nathan was still awake when I got home. I told him what Mallory had shown me and what she had admitted. Then I said something I did not enjoy saying. I wanted her to be more guilty. Nathan waited. It would have made the whole thing cleaner. Mom manipulates the story. Dad makes the money decisions. Mallory benefits because she's the golden child. Everyone gets a role. And now? Now she asked one good question. Got a bad answer? Knew it was a bad answer? And decided not to ask another one. That's still something. I know. I sat across from him at the kitchen table. But it isn't what I accused her of. That mattered to me because my mother had spent weeks forcing complicated facts into a simple story about me. Nathan changed Claire. Claire abandoned us. Claire wants revenge. If I took Mallory's cowardice and inflated it into deliberate financial misconduct because I resented her, I would be doing a cleaner, quieter version of the same thing. My mother taught all of us to prefer stories where everybody has a clear part, I said. I don't think I'm as immune to that as I wanted to believe. Nathan reached for his coffee. You corrected yourself. After accusing her, still counts. A week later, Mallory called me from her car. She sounded shaken. I asked Mom about your name. I sat up. What exactly did you ask? I asked why your name was on files you never reviewed. What did she say? That everybody needs to stop pulling at separate threads. I waited. Mallory continued. She said the family has to stay united until this is resolved. Did she answer the question? No. What did you say? I told her united doesn't mean everybody repeating the same story. That was not a sentence I ever expected to hear from Mallory. She gave a short, unhappy laugh. She didn't like that. I did not ask her to choose me. I did not tell her she finally understood. I simply said, keep your own messages. Mallory was quiet. Claire? Yeah? I should have asked Dad again. I closed my eyes. Yes, I said. You should have. By December, Dad asked for another meeting. This time, the limited remediation summary had been updated. He still presented it as something manageable. Assets could be sold. Expenses could be cut. One location could potentially be consolidated. Some obligations might already be fully funded once the contract-level reconciliation was complete. The company was not disappearing the next morning. Then I reached the preliminary range. I thought I had misread it. Is that 1.4 million? The advisor answered before Dad could. Approximately. At this stage, subject to reconciliation, not stolen cash, not money missing from every customer, an estimated funding deficiency, and related obligations requiring remediation. Approximately $1,400,000. Dad leaned toward me. This is why I need you. I looked at the number again. For weeks, Richard had acted as though he wanted me back, because one angry client preferred my voice on the phone. Now I understood. He was not asking me to save a funeral. He was getting ready to ask me to help hold up an empire. By January, $1.4 million had stopped being a frightening number on a preliminary summary and become a series of decisions nobody in my family wanted to make. Bennett Family Funeral Homes was still operating, but the fiction that one strong quarter would quietly repair everything had finally died. Outside professionals were reconciling contracts one by one. Certain pre-need activity was restricted while that happened. The company was paying for advisors it had never needed before. Vendors were watching more closely, and conversations that Dad used to control from behind his office door now included lawyers, accountants, and people who did not care how many generations of Bennetts had worked in funeral service. That was when my father made me his best offer. He invited me to lunch at a private dining room in a hotel near Buckhead. Karen knew about the meeting, and Dad knew she knew, which removed most of his usual opportunities to make something sound like a casual family conversation afterward. He had a folder waiting beside his plate. Inside was a proposed 6-month return to Bennett Family Funeral Homes with a higher title, more authority, and what he called a path to ownership once the company stabilized. I read the first page and closed it. "You spent 14 years saying ownership wasn't something we needed to discuss yet," I said. "Now you want to discuss it when the company needs my name." Dad's face tightened. "It needs your experience. It has managers. It needs someone lenders trust. I don't talk to your lenders. People know who you are, Claire. Staff trusts you. Families trust you. The people reviewing this mess know you were the one who raised the concern." There it was. He was not offering me equity because he had finally recognized my value. He was offering it because my value had become useful in a new way. "You want me standing beside you when you tell everyone the business is stable. I want my daughter helping me save what belongs to our family. It doesn't belong to me. It could. Now." Dad leaned back. "Does it matter when? If I'm offering it?" "Yes." He looked genuinely hurt by that answer. That was what made dealing with him difficult. Richard Bennett was capable of manipulation without experiencing himself as manipulative. In his mind, he was fighting for something sacred. The company was not an LLC with cash flow, obligations, employees, and 3 physical locations. It was his father, his grandfather, every funeral he had ever directed, every widow who had hugged him in a parking lot, and every Christmas dinner where somebody had raised a glass to the Bennett name. He believed saving the company and saving the family were the same act. I asked him, "If there were no business left to save, would you still be sitting here asking for your daughter back?" Dad blinked. I waited. He looked down at the folder. "That's not a fair question. It is the simplest question I've asked you. We're talking about a real crisis. I'm talking about us." He rubbed his forehead. "Claire, this isn't the time for emotional tests." That was my answer. I pushed the folder back across the table. "Then I'm not coming back." Mom tried 2 weeks later. She came to our house alone, carrying a bakery box from the place that made the almond cake I had loved since college. Nathan was still at work, and I almost admired the precision of the timing. Mom had spent my whole life understanding which setting made a conversation feel least confrontational. Kitchen table. Coffee. Familiar food. No witnesses. She waited until I poured tea before saying, "I'm sorry the memorial hurt you." I looked at her. Not "I'm sorry I did it." Not "I'm sorry I told people your husband changed you." Not "I'm sorry I put your childhood pictures beneath black flowers." "The memorial hurt you." "I appreciate that you can identify the effect," I said. Mom exhaled. "Do you have to analyze every apology?" "Only the ones that avoid the verb." Her eyes narrowed. "Fine. I'm sorry we held the memorial." "Why did you?" "Because we were devastated." "That's not what I asked." She looked away. "Your father thought he was losing everything. You were leaving. The company was already under pressure. Nathan was becoming your priority. My husband being a priority at my wedding was not a conspiracy. You know what I mean? I usually do. That's part of the problem." Mom opened the bakery box and cut the cake without asking whether I wanted any. "Richard is not sleeping. He has lost weight. He has spent his entire life building something, and now strangers are deciding whether he deserves to keep it. You know him. You know what this is doing to him. I do. Then help him. There it was. The apology had lasted less than 5 minutes before turning into a transaction. Come back for 6 months, she said. You don't have to stay forever. Help stabilize things. Help the families. Help your father get through this. And then if you still want your new life, nobody will stop you. My new life isn't something you're granting permission for. Stop twisting everything. I'm not twisting anything. You came here to apologize, and now the apology depends on me returning to work. It does not depend on anything. Then we're done discussing the company. Mom's mouth tightened. Do you understand what a public failure will do to your father? Then stop asking me to lie about what happened. I'm not asking you to lie. You want me to stand beside him so everyone sees Claire came back. Claire trusts us. Claire is helping. Whatever the records eventually show, the photograph will already exist. She stared at me. That was the moment I knew I had finally named the thing she wanted, without needing an email to prove it. Mom stood and closed the cake box. One day, when your father is gone, you're going to remember how hard you made this. Maybe. You'll regret it. Maybe. She seemed almost angry that I did not argue. I walked her to the door. The moral part became harder in February, when Karen showed me the portions of a remediation proposal that I was legitimately allowed to see because the company had sent them while seeking my cooperation as a former operations director. The picture was more complicated than the one my parents had used to frighten relatives. Not every pre-need contract was affected. Some accounts were fully funded. Some needed reconciliation because the timing of records did not match. Others were part of the actual deficiency that required money to be restored or services protected through another arrangement. The company had options. None were painless. Business assets could be sold. One location could potentially be transferred to another licensed operator. An interim servicing agreement could allow another funeral provider to handle certain affected contracts while the larger sale and remediation process continued. My knowledge could help reviewers understand old operational history, service changes, vendor relationships, and why certain notes appeared where they did. What they did not need was for me to become management again. That distinction gave me a path I had not been able to see when Dad first started using customers as a reason I had to return. I told Karen, I'll answer factual questions about things I personally handled. Good. I'll help identify operational history if they formally request it. Fine. I won't sign a guarantee. Also fine. I won't invest money. That decision is yours. And I'm not going back on payroll. Karen nodded. Then put those limits in writing. So I did. I agreed to cooperate through controlled requests. If someone asked why a particular service had been rescheduled 3 years earlier and I had documented the reason, I answered. If someone needed me to confirm whether an operational note matched the way a location actually worked at the time, I answered. If a question belonged to pre-need finance, I said I did not know. It was strangely freeing to say those 3 words. I don't know. For years, I had treated them like professional failure. Now they were sometimes the most accurate answer I could give. Then Grace Ellis died in April. Harold called me shortly after 7 in the morning. I knew something was wrong before he said anything because he did not begin with hello. Grace passed last night. I sat down at the edge of our bed. Nathan was already awake beside me but did not interrupt. I'm sorry, Harold. He took a breath that sounded unsteady. She was comfortable. Our daughter was there. I let him talk for a while. Then he said, I called Bennett's. My stomach tightened. They told me somebody else may be handling it. A different funeral home. I don't understand any of this, Claire. Grace picked everything. She picked the casket. She picked the hymns. She even wrote down which dress she wanted because she didn't trust me to remember the blue one from our anniversary. His voice broke on the last sentence. This was the moment my parents had been invoking for months. Not a spreadsheet. Not a regulator. A 79-year-old man whose wife had died and who wanted the promise they had paid for to mean something. The old version of me would have said, I'll take care of it. The words nearly came out. Instead, I said, Harold, I don't have authority over the contract anymore, but I know who does. I gave him the direct contact Karen had confirmed I was permitted to provide for company counsel and the licensed neighboring provider operating under the interim servicing arrangement. Then, with Harold's permission, I contacted the appropriate person, only to let them know he was trying to reach them. I did not promise him what they would decide. I did not authorize $1. I did not tell anyone to transfer anything. The verification still took time. For most of that day, Harold called me twice, because he was frightened the arrangements Grace chose would disappear inside the business dispute. I kept telling him what I actually knew, and refusing to pretend I knew more. By the following day, the provider had confirmed what portions of the arrangement could be honored and what administrative work still had to be completed. There were phone calls, signatures, and a tense delay over one item that had to be verified before the service schedule could be finalized. It was not magical. It was not smooth. But Grace received the funeral she and Harold had planned. I attended as Claire Reed, not as a representative of Bennett Family Funeral Homes. Harold stood beside the casket before the service and touched the sleeve of Grace's blue dress. "She was right about the dress," he said quietly. "I would have picked the green one." I smiled. Then he looked at me. "Your father said you left them." I did not ask how recently Dad had told him that. "I left the company." He made it sound like the same thing. "I know." Harold looked toward the front of the chapel, where one of the interim provider's funeral directors was checking the service order. "You still answered my phone call. That doesn't mean I went back." "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't. That was the first time someone outside my marriage understood the distinction without asking me to defend it. Dad understood it too. He simply hated it. He called 2 days after Grace's funeral. 'So you'll help strangers,' he said, 'but not your own father.'" I stood near the window of my office at the hospice network. Behind me, 2 coworkers were discussing a staffing change I had nothing to do with. Nobody had asked me to fix it. Months earlier, I would have found that unsettling. Now I barely noticed. Harold isn't a stranger. You know what I mean. I helped him reach the people responsible for a promise our company made. Our company. Your company. Dad went quiet. I continued. I didn't manage the contract. I didn't authorize funds. I didn't come back to work. I helped a grieving man find the people who had authority to help him. You could be doing that for every family. There are people being paid to do that. Not like you. That old sentence. Not like you. Only you. Claire will handle it. I said, I helped the people we made promises to. I won't help you pretend those promises belong to you. What the hell does that mean? It means protecting customers and protecting Bennett ownership are not the same thing. They are if the company has to survive to serve them. Apparently they're not. Another provider served Grace. Dad inhaled sharply. I knew that hurt him. I did not enjoy it. But pain was not proof that I was wrong. If the name disappears, he said, everything your grandfather built disappears with it. No. The work he did already happened. You don't get to hold customers hostage to a surname so the surname survives. Dad disconnected. By May, the possibility he had been refusing to name became real enough that even Mom stopped calling it temporary. One of the 3 locations was being marketed as part of a broader remediation and continuity plan. Other business assets were under review. The goal was not to liquidate everything in a weekend. It was to create enough money and operational stability to protect valid obligations while transferring responsibility to people who could actually carry them. Dad fought the sale. Then company counsel explained what fighting could cost. I did not sit in those private legal meetings, and I did not know every argument made inside them. What I learned came later through documents and communications I was legitimately shown in connection with my cooperation. The basic choice was clear. If Richard and Diane refused a negotiated remediation framework and the orderly transfer failed, the alternatives could expose them to much uglier litigation, the risk of outside control, and obligations tied to personal guarantees they had signed years earlier. For the first time, the lake house appeared in the same conversation as the funeral homes. So did investment assets my parents had always treated as proof that the Bennett business had succeeded. They were not simply seized overnight. Dad and Mom agreed, through the settlement framework their lawyers negotiated, to contribute proceeds from personal investments and eventually the lake house, while the business sale covered a larger share of the shortfall. Dad had spent years risking future obligations to protect the appearance that nothing needed to shrink. Now he had to shrink his own life to protect those obligations. Mallory's celebration of life division did not survive the process. She called me after the decision became final enough that employees had been told. "They're closing it." I sat quietly. "I know." "No, you don't. You left before it became mine." I understood what she meant. Whatever mistakes Mallory had made, she had built real things there. Families had liked what she created. Employees had believed in it. Losing the division was not imaginary punishment. "I'm sorry," I said. She laughed bitterly. "Are you?" "Yes. You hated the expansion. I thought it was too fast. I didn't want it destroyed." She was silent. Then she said, "Dad keeps saying if you'd come back earlier, we might have kept it. Do you believe him?" Another silence. "No." That was progress, although neither of us called it that. Mallory began clearing old business and wedding materials from her personal accounts because counsel had instructed everyone to preserve relevant communications first and separate what needed to be retained from ordinary clutter. A few days later, she called me again. This time her voice sounded different. "Claire, I found something." "What?" "A message from Mom." I stopped typing. "When?" "October 7th. The date landed immediately. 4 days after I had put my request for an independent review in writing. The day Mom booked Salon B, Mallory continued. "It's in the thread from when she asked me to help gather the family photographs. I did not speak. She told me not to delete anything, so I didn't. I just hadn't gone back this far." "What does it say?" Mallory took a breath. Then she read it. "Get the family together before Claire starts telling everyone her version. If she comes after us afterward, they need to remember what she chose first." I looked at the wall across from my desk. The wedding. The black dresses. The photographs. Farewell to our daughter. All those months, part of me had wondered whether I was giving my mother too much strategic credit. Maybe the memorial really had been grief weaponized in the moment. Maybe she had only wanted to punish me for leaving. Mallory's voice came back through the phone. "Claire, this wasn't just Mom being hurt. No. She was getting everyone on her side before the review." I closed my eyes. For the first time, we had her saying it before the funeral ever began. Mallory sent the entire message thread to the company attorney and preserved the original on her phone. I did not circulate it to relatives, and I did not forward it to the people who had followed Mom into Salon B. By then, I had learned something my mother still had not. Truth became stronger when you stopped trying to make it perform. The message mattered because of its date, and because it fit what had already happened. It did not prove a dollar was missing. It did not prove Mom understood every accounting decision Dad had made. It proved that 4 days after I requested an independent review, my mother was already preparing our relatives to interpret anything I said afterward as retaliation. That was enough. I did not need to make it mean more. By late spring, the rest of the evidence had become much harder for my parents to explain away. I learned what I was entitled to learn through several specific channels. Documents Karen received because they related to my cooperation as a former director. Materials the company itself produced and authenticated during the review. Dad's earlier remediation summaries, and messages Mallory had personally received and preserved. Nobody sat me down and handed me the secret history of Bennett family funeral homes. I saw pieces as they became relevant, and over several months those pieces stopped contradicting one another. The financial layer came first. Contract-level reconciliation. Banking confirmations, and funding records established that some customer payments connected to pre-need obligations had not been moved into the proper segregated funding process when they should have been. Some delays were later corrected. Others accumulated while the company used operating liquidity to cover expenses it should have cut, including losses connected to Mallory's expansion. The final picture was more complicated than Dad stole $1.4 million, and I was glad the professionals insisted on that distinction. Some customer obligations had always been funded properly. Some accounts needed correction rather than replacement. But the material deficiency was real. and so was the fact that Richard Bennett had repeatedly chosen another quarter over admitting the company needed to shrink. The second layer was knowledge. The original company copies of Helen's emails were produced, and their metadata matched the dates on the versions she had retained. Her warning had not been invented after she quit. She had told my parents that the balances could no longer be reconciled as ordinary timing differences. Dad had replied, "Use the prior reporting method. We'll correct it after next quarter." Mom's message about keeping the warning in the owner file and giving me only the operations version was there too. Those emails did not turn Helen into a hero. She had still carried items forward longer than she should have and accepted explanations she no longer believed. But they established something important. She had warned the owners, and the owners had chosen continuation. Then came the detail that made me sit completely still in Karen's office. The company system kept an audit record of administrator activity. The CRM note on the file that said, "Claire reviewed no concerns," had not been entered by some overwhelmed receptionist using careless shorthand. It had been entered through Mom's administrator account. On a day my calendar, training registration, and travel receipt all confirmed I had been out of town. I read the line on the authenticated report and felt less satisfaction than I expected. For months, I had imagined what it would feel like to know who had used my name. I thought anger would arrive first. Instead, I felt something closer to recognition. My mother had not forged my signature. She had done something much more natural to her. She had borrowed my credibility. When a client needed reassurance, Claire reviewed it, sounded safe. When a relative needed an explanation, Nathan changed, Claire sounded safe. When a financial warning threatened the image of the family, Claire worries too much sounded safe. Mom's gift had always been knowing which story made everyone in the room relax. The final layer was the wedding. Mallory's October 7th message did not prove the funding deficiency. The financial records did that. It did not prove Dad's decisions. His own replies and authorizations did that. What it proved was why the memorial had happened when it did. Mom had known I was asking questions. She had known I was leaving. And before I had accused anyone publicly of anything, she wanted the family gathered around a version of me that would make future questions look vindictive. The black flowers had not been evidence of a financial crime. They had been evidence of motive. Once I understood those layers, the entire year rearranged itself in my mind. Dad's first question had been, "Who else have you told?" Mom's first instinct had been to ask why I was digging. Then relatives began hearing Nathan wanted me separated from the family. Then Salon B appeared. Then my symbolic funeral. The financial problem and the family drama had never been two separate stories. Dad had been trying to postpone consequences inside the company. Mom had been trying to postpone consequences outside it. Neither strategy survived the summer. The negotiated remediation and transfer agreement was not signed in one dramatic meeting. There were weeks of revisions, conditions, valuations, arguments over assets, and questions about which obligations would remain with which entity during the transition. By June, though, the outcome Dad had spent months refusing to name became unavoidable. A successor operator would acquire one of the key locations, along with selected business assets, and assume servicing responsibilities according to the approved transition structure. Proceeds from that transaction would fund a large part of the remediation. Other obligations would continue being reconciled in stages. Richard would lose managing control when the closing conditions were satisfied. That sentence hurt him more than the dollar amount ever had. The LLC had been his kingdom because he had never called it a kingdom. He called it legacy. He called it stewardship. He called it family. But when the agreement required him to surrender management authority, he fought over language that did not change the economic result. He wanted a consulting title, then an advisory role, then a transition position, with enough authority to still feel like authority. The answer kept getting smaller. My parents were not thrown into poverty. That would have been ridiculous and, frankly, unnecessary. The business sale covered much of what needed to be addressed. But years earlier, Dad and Mom had also signed personal guarantees connected to certain business financing. Under the negotiated settlement, rather than gamble on more destructive litigation and the possibility of an externally imposed solution, they agreed to contribute proceeds from investment assets and the eventual sale of the lake house. The lake house was where Dad had taken photographs every summer beneath a wooden sign carved with Bennett family. Mom had redecorated the kitchen twice because she wanted magazines to photograph it for charity event features. They had treated that house as proof that 3 generations of sacrifice had worked. Now part of its value was going toward obligations Richard had postponed while insisting the family could not afford to look weak. Dad asked me to save his ownership one final time before the agreement became irreversible. He came to my house without Mom. Nathan was there, but went upstairs after Dad asked if he could speak privately. Dad sat across from me in the living room carrying a folder I did not touch. "We still have a window," he said. "For what?" "If we bring in capital and show continuity. There's a structure where we may be able to retain a minority position." "Ve?" "You know what I mean. I actually want you to say it." Dad's jaw tightened. "If you invested and came back into management, it would change the conversation." I almost admired the endurance of the idea. Months earlier, he had offered me ownership because he needed my credibility. Now, with control slipping away, he wanted my savings and my labor too. "How much?" He gave me a range. It was large enough that I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because the request finally stripped away every sentimental layer he usually wrapped around these conversations. "You want me to put my money into a company I never owned so you can keep owning part of it. You'd own part too. After I recapitalize the problem. You know the business better than the successor people do." "That isn't an answer." Dad leaned forward. "Claire, if the Bennett family keeps an ownership position, we can rebuild." "Why should I want that?" His face went blank. I had never asked him that before. Not whether it was possible. Not whether the numbers worked. Why should I want it? "Because it's ours." "No, it was yours. Your grandfather. Granddad is dead, Dad." He flinched. I continued before he could turn the conversation into sacrilege. "I loved him. I respected what he built. That doesn't mean I owe my retirement savings to decisions he didn't make. This is your name too. My name isn't collateral." Dad stood and walked toward the window. "There are still families depending on the transition. I'll cooperate with the transition. That's not enough. It is for the families." He turned around. "You could save this." I looked at him and finally understood how deeply he believed that sentence. He was not lying. In Richard Bennett's mind, if I possessed the ability to reduce his loss, refusing to do so was an act against him. "I'm not guaranteeing your ownership," I said. "I'm not putting my savings into the LLC. I'm not returning as management. If someone needs operational history from me to protect a customer obligation, I'll answer through the process we've already established." Dad stared at me. "That's what I'm willing to save." He left without opening the folder. The family's reaction to Mom's message happened more quietly. Mallory was the one who finally showed Aunt Carol the October 7th thread. Carol had been in Salon B. She had cried when Mom cried. She had also called me afterward to say I should remember that parents sometimes did hurtful things when they were terrified of losing a child. After reading Mom's message, she called me again. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You didn't know." I didn't ask. That sounded familiar enough that I almost smiled. Carol told me Mom had called her that morning, insisting Mallory was twisting old messages and that I was feeding information to everyone to turn the family against them. "She wanted me to call you," Carol said. "To say what?" "That destroying your parents' reputation won't undo what happened." I rubbed my forehead. "Did she mention that I haven't sent you anything?" "No." There was a pause. Then Carol said, "I told her not to call me anymore to tell me what you supposedly did. If you want me to know something, you can tell me yourself." I sat quietly after she said it. That sentence was probably a bigger punishment to Mom than any argument I could have won. Diane Bennett had spent decades as the family translator. Somebody was upset, Mom explained why. Somebody made a mistake. Mom explained what they had meant. Somebody was absent, Mom explained where they were and what they were thinking. People had accepted her version because most of the time it seemed easier than calling the person directly. Now they were starting to go around her. Not everyone. Some relatives still believed I should have handled everything privately. One uncle insisted every family business moved money around when times were difficult and that outsiders would never understand. A longtime church friend told Mom she thought daughters owed parents more grace than I had shown. I did not need unanimous agreement. That was new for me too. The most painful judgment did not come from me, a regulator, or an accountant. It came from Uncle Walter. Granddad's younger brother had been part of Bennett family funeral homes long before I was born, though he sold his small interest years earlier and retired. He was 73 by then and walked with a cane after a hip replacement. Dad had invoked him repeatedly during the review, usually as proof that the older generation understands what family means. Walter called me in June and asked if I would meet him at the original Bennett location on the morning the successor operator was taking control of the building. I almost declined because I assumed he wanted one final lecture. Instead, I went. The sign outside still said Bennett Family Funeral Homes. Inside, employees were sorting keys, access cards, and files for the transition. Nothing looked like a funeral. There were no reporters, no angry crowd, just people doing the administrative work required when one organization stopped controlling a building and another began. Dad stood in the front office with company counsel. Walter was beside him. When I walked in, Dad looked irritated. "Why is she here?" Walter answered. "Because I asked her." He reached inside his jacket and took out the ceremonial brass key. I recognized it immediately. The same key from the photograph in Dad's office. The same key Mom had put on the slideshow at my living memorial, while Dad talked about how Bennetts did not walk away. Walter placed it on the desk. Dad stared at it. "What are you doing?" Walter rested both hands on his cane. "Your father gave us that key because he trusted us with his name." Dad's face hardened. "Don't do this here," Walter continued. "You spent a year telling everybody you did what you did to protect the Bennett name. Stop using your father for that. I kept this business alive. You kept your chair." Dad's face went red. Walter nodded toward the key. "I don't trust you to use my name as an excuse anymore." No one spoke. I did not feel victorious. I felt sad. That was the difference between fantasy revenge and watching something actually die. Richard had built a life around being the Bennett who preserved the legacy. The person who finally told him he had failed was not the daughter he could dismiss as angry. It was the generation he had spent the entire story claiming to defend. Walter looked at me before he left. "You don't need to take that." I glanced at the key. "I don't want it." He nodded once. Neither did he. A few days after the transfer documents were signed, Dad came to see me outside my new office. He looked thinner than he had at the wedding. His clothes were still expensive. His car was still nicer than mine. Nobody had destroyed him physically. He simply looked like a man who had spent months discovering that authority could disappear long before the building did. "You got what you wanted," he said. I leaned against my car. "No. The location's gone. The division's gone. Your mother and I are selling the lake house. Walter won't speak to me. Don't stand there and pretend this isn't what you wanted. What I wanted was for you to stop before any of this became necessary. You could have saved it." I had heard that sentence in so many forms that it no longer reached the part of me it used to control. I said, "I saved what belonged to the families. The rest belonged to you." Dad looked away. For 1 second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he said, "I hope you're happy. I hope one day you understand those are not the same thing." Then I got into my car. I did not watch him leave. Several weeks later, my mother sent me a text. By then, relatives were contacting me directly instead of asking her what I supposedly thought. The lake house was under contract. Dad no longer controlled the original location. Mallory's division was gone. Mom had stepped away from at least one community committee she had spent years treating like part of her identity. Her message contained no apology, no question about my life, no mention of Nathan. Just one sentence. "Your father and I have lost almost everything. I hope you're satisfied. I read it at my kitchen table and set the phone down. For months, Mom had tried to make every consequence in our family belong to me. This time, I decided not to answer her until I knew exactly which part still did. I waited until the next evening before answering my mother's message. A year earlier, I would have replied within minutes, either defending myself or correcting every implication packed into the sentence. Your father and I have lost almost everything. I hope you're satisfied. It was the kind of message Diane Bennett had perfected. No direct accusation, no acknowledgement of how we had arrived there, just enough pain to make me feel responsible for relieving it. This time I read it, went to work, came home, ate dinner with Nathan, slept, and answered when I was no longer responding from anger. You held a funeral because I chose a life you couldn't control. I didn't take your business. I didn't take your friends. I didn't take your family. I stopped lying for you and stopped fixing the consequences of choices I didn't make. Everything that left after that made its own decision. Her answer came almost immediately. So that's it? I stared at the screen for a few seconds. No. That's just the part you finally have to handle yourself. I muted her number after that. I did not announce permanent no contact. I did not tell Nathan I was finished with my parents forever. I simply decided that for a while, access to me would not be the automatic reward for sending guilt through my phone. My mother had spent months making every consequence a test of whether I loved her enough to absorb it. I was done taking that test. By the end of June, the transfer of the original Bennett location had moved far enough that Richard no longer controlled daily operations. The successor company kept the Bennett name on the building during the transition because the name still had value in the community, which was an irony I could not have designed better if I had tried. Dad had spent his life insisting the name was bigger than any individual. In the end, he got his wish. Bennett Family Funeral Homes remained on the sign, while Richard Bennett no longer owned the decisions being made beneath it. I learned the final structure through documents Karen was permitted to review in connection with the matters I had cooperated on. The business sale and other company assets covered most of the remediation. The personal guarantees Dad and Mom had signed on separate business financing meant they could not simply walk away untouched, and under the negotiated resolution, they contributed investment proceeds and the money from the lake house sale rather than risk a longer fight that might leave them with even less control. They were not poor. They did not move into somebody's basement or start counting grocery money. Dad still had a comfortable retirement compared with most people. Mom still had nice clothes and a good house. Their punishment was not poverty. It was subtraction. No office where everyone waited for Dad to decide. No 3-location business he could point to as proof he had preserved his father's legacy. No lake house with Bennett family carved above the porch. No expansion to hand down to Mallory. No ceremonial brass key. Walter told me Dad tried to give the key back to him after the transition. Walter refused it. What would I do with it? He asked me when we had coffee in July. The door it was supposed to represent isn't his anymore. I thought about taking the key myself once, not because I wanted ownership, but because part of me still reacted to objects like records. Keep it, preserve it, file it somewhere so history remains organized. I did not ask for it. For the first time, the Bennett legacy was allowed to exist without somebody assigning it to me. Mom's loss was harder to measure because there was no closing document for reputation. Nobody issued a statement saying Diane Bennett had lost 40% of her social influence. She was not exiled from Georgia. People still spoke to her. Some relatives continued, insisting she had only been protecting her husband. A few old friends believed family financial problems should never have left the family, even after I reminded them that customers had been involved. But she stopped being the person everyone automatically called for the official version. Aunt Carol called me directly when she wanted to know whether Nathan and I would attend a cousin's anniversary party. Aunt Linda stopped beginning conversations with, "Your mother told me." Walter dealt with me without routing anything through my parents. Small changes, but Mom noticed them because she had spent decades standing at the center of those connections. Mallory sent me a photograph from a Sunday dinner in late July. Mom had set the dining room table the way she always did for family gatherings. White linen, good china, water glasses lined up perfectly. The table could seat 14. There were 4 place settings. Dad, Mom, Mallory, a cousin I barely knew who still lived nearby. I looked at the picture for a moment and felt no urge to frame it as justice. Empty chairs were still empty chairs. Whatever my mother had done, loneliness was not funny. Mallory called later that evening. She spent all afternoon cooking, she said. Then she got mad at everyone who didn't come. What did she say? Same things. People are judging her. You turned everyone against her. Nobody remembers what she did for the family. I waited. Mallory added. I told her to stop. That surprised me more than the photograph. What happened? She said you had poisoned me too. I could hear the exhaustion in my sister's voice. What did you say? I said if she wants to know what you think, she should ask you. I'm not doing messages anymore. I smiled. She hated that. I imagined she did. Mallory had changed too. Although not in the dramatic way stories usually demand from younger sisters. She did not arrive at my door sobbing and confessing every selfish thing she had ever done. We did not become inseparable. There were still subjects that could turn a normal lunch into an argument in less than 30 seconds. She lost the Celebration of Life division and took a job with an event services company outside the Bennett network. The title was smaller, the salary was lower. Nobody cared who her father was. During her second month there, she called me after a vendor failed to deliver equipment for a large corporate event. My old reflex came alive before she finished describing the problem. I could already see 3 ways to solve it. Then Mallory said, "Don't tell me what to do." I laughed. I wasn't going to. You absolutely were. Probably. She told me how she had found another vendor, negotiated an emergency delivery, changed the setup schedule, and explained the delay to her manager before anyone had to ask her. Then she said, almost sheepishly, "Something went wrong today. I fixed it myself." I sat back in my chair. I knew you could. There was a pause. That's all? What do you want, a parade? She laughed. That was more healing than an apology speech would have been. Harold Ellis sent me a handwritten note in July. He did not write about financial reviews or regulators. He wrote about Grace. He told me their daughter had taken home the blue dress afterward because she wanted to keep the buttons. He said the service had felt like the one Grace chose when they sat down years earlier and made arrangements neither of them ever wanted to use. Near the end, he wrote, "Your father told me you walked away. From where I stood, you were the one who made sure the promise still meant something. I kept that note. Not because it proved Dad wrong, because it reminded me that the choice had never actually been between abandoning everyone and returning to save the company. My parents had presented those as the only 2 options because the second one benefited them. There had always been a third. Help the person in front of you without volunteering to carry the institution that failed them. That lesson followed me into my new job. By August, I had been at the hospice and bereavement network long enough that people had stopped treating me like the new hire. I had projects I owned, staff who came to me with legitimate questions, and a director who occasionally told me no, without turning the disagreement into a family betrayal. The first time she rejected one of my proposals, I spent an embarrassing amount of energy preparing an argument before realizing I did not need to win every decision to remain respected. Nathan noticed the difference before I did. One evening we were making dinner when he put a pan in the wrong cabinet. I opened the cabinet, saw it sitting where the baking dishes belonged, and moved it. He watched me. "What?" "Nothing. You have a face. I just wanted to see whether marriage had cured you." "Of what?" "Believing there is one correct location for every object in the universe." "There is." He laughed. We still argued. Sometimes I gave advice when he wanted sympathy. Sometimes he told me a problem from work, and I started solving it before he finished describing it. Once he interrupted me halfway through a list and said, "I am complaining, Claire. I am not submitting a service request." I was offended for almost 5 seconds. Then I laughed. Being free of my parents did not magically remove every trait that had made me useful to them. I still liked order. I still liked answers. I still noticed problems faster than most people around me, and some part of me still enjoyed being the person who could solve them. The difference was that I had stopped treating every visible problem as an assignment. One afternoon at work, somebody replaced a photograph in the hallway outside my office and left the frame slightly crooked. I noticed it every time I passed. On the third trip, my hand actually lifted toward it. Then I stopped. The picture was not going to fall. Nobody was grieving because it leaned half an inch to the left. There was no client waiting. No employee depending on me. No disaster. It was simply crooked. I walked past it. That should not have felt as satisfying as it did. The last object I dealt with was harder. When we cleaned out the wedding boxes months after the reception, I found one of the printed programs from Mom's memorial. I do not know how it ended up with our things. Maybe Aunt Linda had carried it back into the ballroom. Maybe the planner had gathered everything left in the hallway. I had put it into an envelope because, at the time, nearly everything connected to that room felt like something I might one day need to prove had happened. The front still read, "Farewell to our daughter." Inside were photographs from my childhood, and a paragraph about honoring the life and memories of the Claire Bennett my family had known. I stood in our home office holding it and thought about the woman my parents claimed to have lost. She answered after midnight when a manager panicked. She fixed Mallory's vendors. She absorbed Dad's bad planning. She let Mom explain her feelings to other people. She believed that being the most capable person in the room meant she was responsible for whatever happened inside it. My parents had called that woman loyal. I had called her necessary. For a long time, I had mistaken both words for loved. Nathan walked past the doorway and saw the program in my hand. "You keeping that?" I looked down at it. Once, I would have kept it forever because evidence made me feel safe. But the records that mattered had already been preserved where they belonged. I did not need this one for Karen. I did not need it for the review. I did not need to show it to another relative. No, I dropped it into the recycling box beside the desk. I did not burn it. I did not tear it into dramatic little pieces. I just stopped storing it. My parents had held a funeral because they believed marriage, and leaving the family business meant the daughter they knew was dead. For months, I thought the cruelty was that they were willing to mourn me while I was still alive. I understood it differently now. They were not mourning me. They were mourning access. They were mourning the daughter who answered every call, absorbed every consequence, protected every reputation, and confused being indispensable with being loved. That woman did not die at my wedding. She walked out of the hotel with me. She just stopped working for free. And for the first time in my life, I understood that being needed was something I could choose. Being loved was never supposed to require it. When you are the person everyone depends on, it is easy to mistake being useful for being loved. This story shows why you must learn where your responsibility ends. You can help people without protecting bad decisions that hurt them. You can tell the truth without seeking revenge, set boundaries without abandoning compassion, and refuse to sacrifice your future to preserve someone else's reputation. When money, family, or business is involved, document what you know, ask questions early, protect innocent people, and never let guilt pressure you into accepting responsibility for choices you did not make. Most importantly, remember that love should not require you to become someone's permanent rescue plan. If a relationship only works when you keep fixing every crisis, that relationship needs to change. If this story gave you perspective today, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories about boundaries, consequences, and choosing yourself.